the darkness presses down. Not the comforting kind, but a weight that seeps into every cobblestone and alley, pressing beneath Victorian London where gaslight flickers and something ancient stirs. Carriages rattle, church bells toll. Lives continue above, unaware that the streets were never meant to hold so many dead. Because this city is lying to itself. Beneath the cobblestones are plague pits sealed in terror, crypts packed until bones cracked against stone, mass graves hurriedly covered so commerce could continue and society could pretend nothing was wrong. When cholera swept through alleyways and fever climbed stairwells, bodies were lowered fast, stacked deep, and forgotten. The living walked on. The dead stayed. If you're drawn to the hidden history, the parts they buried, the truths left to rot beneath progress, subscribe now and stay with me. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, because every city has its own shadows. Tonight, we descend beneath Victorian London itself into plague-soaked soil, sealed chambers, and graves that still breathe beneath the streets. These are the deadly secrets the city tried to forget, and the ground that remembers everything. The silence comes first, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but a heavy, waiting stillness pressed flat beneath Victorian London like a held breath. Above it, the city lives loudly. Iron wheels scream against stone. Hooves strike sparks from cobbles. Gas lamps hiss and tremble in the fog. People hurry past one another, collars up, eyes forward, unaware that the ground beneath their feet is not solid history but layered memory, compressed, crowded, and full of the dead. Victorian London is not a city built upon land. It is a city built upon burial. Long before the age of railways and sewers, before chimneys darkened the sky and factories thickened the air, London learned a dangerous habit. It never stopped stacking its dead beneath itself. Churchyards filled, then swelled. Graves were reopened, bones pushed aside, coffins crushed inward to make room for the newly departed. Death did not wait politely for space. It arrived in waves, plague, fever, hunger, and the city responded not with care, but with concealment. By the 19th century, this concealment had become an art. Beneath churches where hymns echoed and sermons promised eternal rest, crypts were packed tighter each decade. Coffins were stacked floor to ceiling, wood bowing, lids splitting under pressure. Beneath alleyways and marketplaces lay plague pits dug in terror centuries earlier, mass graves sealed hastily when death moved faster than prayer. Many were never marked. Others were deliberately erased from maps when they became inconvenient. The city grew over them without ceremony. Brick and mortar laid directly atop the panic of earlier generations. The Victorians sensed it, even if they refused to speak its name. There were smells that appeared in warm weather and vanished by winter, streets that sagged slowly over decades, cellars that flooded with foul water after heavy rain. Bones surfaced during repairs, skulls, femurs, small ribs, unmistakably human, only to be quietly removed before they caused alarm. The living walked on. The city learned not to look down, but the dead were never still. London's growth pressed relentlessly into its own burial layers. As populations exploded and housing crowded inward, every inch of ground was contested. Graveyards, once at the edge of town, found themselves swallowed whole, surrounded by tenements and factories. Coffins lay inches beneath floorboards. Children played above soil that shifted and breathed as wood decayed below. In some parishes, the ground rose rather than sank, swollen with centuries of compressed remains. This was the hidden architecture of Victorian London. Bone beneath brick, plague beneath pavement, silence beneath sound. The fear that seeped upward took many forms. Some believed disease rose from the dead themselves, poisonous vapors leaking from disturbed graves. Others blamed God, or filth, or moral decay. But few dared confront the simplest truth that the city had buried too much, too fast, and too carelessly for generations, and now lived directly atop the consequences. Workers felt it first. Gravediggers complained of collapsing pits and crushed coffins. Builders broke into forgotten crypts and found walls of bone stacked like firewood. Engineers, tunneling for pipes and railways, uncovered layers of human history they were never meant to see. Each discovery was handled the same way, quickly, quietly, and without record. To acknowledge the full scale would be to admit that London itself was complicit. This chapter is where we begin, not with plague or crypt or mass grave, but with the realization that Victorian London stood on a foundation that was never stable. A city that presented itself as modern, rational, and progressive was in fact balanced precariously atop centuries of unburied fear. Before we descend into the plague pits and sealed chambers, before we open the crypt doors and expose the forgotten graves, we must understand this first truth. London did not simply hide its dead. It built its future directly on top of them and hoped the ground would stay quiet. The ground did not always feel crowded. There was a time long before gaslight and iron when burial in London was intimate, almost orderly. A parish church stood at the center of life and death alike. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all folded neatly into the same soil. To be buried near the church was a blessing. To lie close to the altar was a promise. Earth was sacred, and there seemed to be enough of it. That illusion did not survive the centuries. As London grew outward and upward, its dead stayed where they were. The medieval city buried generation after generation in the same small churchyards, reopening graves again and again. A coffin was not a permanent resting place. It was a temporary interruption. Bones from earlier burials were gathered, shifted, stacked along the sides of graves, or placed into charnel pits to make space. Skulls were arranged carefully, almost respectfully. Femurs laid like kindling. The dead were not erased, they were rearranged. At first, this was accepted. Death was familiar. The smell of decay was expected near burial grounds. Churchyards were places of life as much as death markets spilled into them. Children played among headstones. Animals grazed between graves. The boundary between the living and the dead was thin and porous, crossed daily without ceremony. But the city did not stop arriving. Plague shattered the old rhythm. When the Black Death swept through London in the 14th century, burial customs collapsed under sheer volume. Priests could not keep up. Families disappeared in days. The dead arrived faster than prayers could be spoken. Trenches were dug in open ground beyond the city walls, bodies lowered in layers, lime scattered hurriedly, soil thrown back with shaking hands. These were not churchyards. They were emergency measures, plague pits meant to be temporary, never meant to be revisited. Yet London returned to them again and again. After each epidemic, life resumed on top of mass death. Walls shifted, streets expanded. What had once been the edge of the city became its interior. Plague pits faded from memory. Their locations whispered but rarely written down. Markers rotted. Records were lost or deliberately vague. It was easier not to know. By the time the medieval period gave way to early modern London, burial space had become a quiet crisis. Churchyards were visibly full. The ground rose higher each decade, swelling with remains. Headstones leaned at strange angles. Rain pooled where earth had compacted unevenly. Coffins were buried inches below the surface. Dogs uncovered bones. Children tripped over fragments of skull after storms. Still, the city continued. Parishes resisted change fiercely. Burial within one's local churchyard was not merely tradition, it was revenue. Funerals paid for upkeep, clergy, and repairs. To refuse burial was to refuse income. To suggest burial elsewhere was to challenge centuries of custom and authority, so the dead kept coming, and the ground kept absorbing them. By the 17th and 18th centuries, burial had become mechanical. Graves were reopened routinely, sometimes within years. Coffins were crushed intentionally to make space. Wood splintered, iron nails bent. Bodies were rearranged without ceremony. What mattered was fitting the new dead into an old system that no longer worked. London learned to normalize the impossible. By the time the Victorians inherited the city, the burial crisis was no longer visible in polite conversation, but it was etched into the soil itself. Centuries of layered remains lay compressed beneath churches, streets, and homes. The city above imagined itself new and advancing. The city below was ancient, overfilled, and restless. This chapter is not about plague pits yet. It is about habit, about how London, long before factories and railways, learned to treat burial as reuse rather than rest. Learned to accept that the dead could be moved, stacked, compressed, and forgotten as long as the surface appeared calm. The Victorians would not create this problem. They would inherit it vast, invisible, and already pressing upward from below. There came a moment when even London could no longer pretend there was room. It did not arrive with ceremony or proclamation. There was no single law, no sudden announcement that death had exceeded its allotted space. Instead, the realization crept in slowly through complaints, through smells, through the uneasy way the ground behaved beneath familiar streets. Churchwardens noticed it first. Gravediggers felt it with their shovels. Physicians began to suspect it when sickness lingered where it should have passed. The city was full, not just with people but with bodies. Parish churchyards, once orderly plots of sacred earth, had become swollen reservoirs of decay. Graves were reopened so frequently that soil no longer settled properly. Coffins collapsed almost as soon as they were buried, their contents merging into the layers below. In some places, burial depth shrank to a few inches. A heavy rain could expose what the living were not meant to see. A careless footstep could break through into something soft and wrong beneath the surface. The smell was impossible to ignore. On warm days, a sickly sweetness drifted through nearby homes and streets, seeping through cellar walls and floorboards. It clung to clothing, it settled in curtains. Residents complained of headaches, nausea, and fevers they blamed on bad air miasma rising from disturbed graves. Whether they understood the science or not, they understood the danger. Something buried too shallowly does not stay buried. Yet burial continued. It had to. There was nowhere else to go. London's population surged relentlessly. Rural families poured into the city seeking work. Housing crowded inward. Space vanished. New burial grounds required land, and land was money, parishes argued. Property owners resisted. The dead were easier to accommodate than the living, at least on paper. A coffin took less space than a family. A grave did not complain, and so the dead were packed tighter. Church authorities sanctioned practices that would have horrified earlier generations. Old remains were routinely cleared from graves to make space for new ones, stacked along the edges or lowered deeper into pits that grew darker and wetter with each reuse. Bones were moved not with reverence, but efficiency. Time was short. Death did not wait. In poorer districts, the situation was worse. The poor died faster and were buried cheaper. Mass graves became common unmarked trenches where bodies were layered quickly, sometimes wrapped only in cloth. There were no headstones, no records worth keeping. The ground absorbed them anonymously, swelling just the same. This was the era when burial began to lose its dignity entirely. The idea of rest, true rest, became a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford vaults, lead-lined coffins, or burial in less used ground. The poor were folded into the city's underlayers without pause. Their deaths became part of the infrastructure. Still, no one spoke openly of running out of space. To do so would be to admit failure not just of planning, but of faith. Churchyards were consecrated ground. To suggest they were insufficient was to question divine order itself. Better to endure the smell, better to ignore the sagging earth, better to bury faster and look away. By the early 19th century, however, denial had consequences. Complaints multiplied. Physicians warned of illness clustering around overcrowded burial grounds. Builders refused to work near certain churches. Property values dropped where grave soil oozed through cellar walls. In some parishes, the ground had risen several feet over centuries of burial, creating unnatural slopes where level yards once stood. The city was no longer just burying its dead, it was being reshaped by them. This chapter marks the turning point, the moment when burial ceased to be a quiet tradition and became an undeniable crisis. A crisis no sermon could soothe, no prayer could compress further into the earth. London had reached the limit of what it could stack, shift, and conceal, and beneath the surface, something dangerous was beginning to press back. The plague never truly left London. It changed names, softened its outline, retreated into memory, but it did not loosen its grip on the ground. Long after the bells stopped tolling and the carts no longer rolled through the streets calling for the dead, the city continued to rest upon the places where fear had once outrun mercy. The first plague pits were not designed. They were dug in desperation. When the Black Death tore through London in the 14th century, burial collapsed almost overnight. Churchyards filled within weeks. Clergy fell ill. Families vanished entire. There was no time for markers, no room for ceremony. Trenches were opened in fields beyond the city walls, wide and deep, meant to swallow hundreds at a time. Bodies were lowered in layers, sometimes wrapped, sometimes not, lime scattered hastily, soil thrown back with shaking hands. These pits were never meant to last. They were emergency wounds cut into the earth. But the earth remembered. When the plague passed, London did not seal these places with care. It simply moved on. The pits were filled, roughly leveled, and forgotten. No stone recorded their presence. No boundary marked them as untouchable. Over time, paths crossed them. Buildings crept closer. Fields became streets. The city expanded inward and outward at once, swallowing its own history without digestion. Centuries later, Victorians walked daily over mass graves without knowing their names, only sensing that something beneath their feet was wrong. The Black Death cast a long shadow not because it killed so many, but because of how it taught London to bury in panic. When later epidemics arrived, sweating sickness, smallpox, typhus, cholera, the template was already written. Dig fast, stack deep, cover quickly, forget. Each outbreak reused the logic of plague pits, even when the pits themselves were no longer visible. Some were reused directly. As burial space dwindled, old plague grounds were quietly reopened. The soil was already used, already compromised. Digging there raised fewer objections. Gravediggers encountered layers of bones that did not match the dates they were burying, skulls darkened by age, ribs fused with earth, bodies compressed beyond recognition. These were not acknowledged as plague victims. They were simply obstacles. The Black Death became anonymous again. By the Victorian era, knowledge of plague pits existed in fragments, half-remembered parish notes. Vague warnings passed between labourers, rumours attached to certain streets. Maps avoided specificity. Records used evasive language. Old burial ground, former wasteland, unwholesome soil. The truth was easier to blur than confront. Yet the ground did not stay silent. During construction and repair, workers broke into spaces that smelled different, older, heavier, damp with centuries of compressed decay. Soil collapsed inward unexpectedly. Coffins disintegrated at a touch. Bones appeared in quantities that made no sense for a single parish yard. When questioned, overseers ordered quick removal and minimal discussion. Panic was bad for business. The Victorians feared plague even as they believed themselves beyond it. They spoke of progress, sanitation, reason, but the memory of sudden, unstoppable death lingered. Any hint that the old disease might rise again was terrifying. And so, When plague pits surfaced, they were treated not as historical sites, but as hazards to be buried again as quickly as possible. The irony was complete. The very measures taken to hide the plague, deep burial, mass graves, forgotten locations, helped preserve its physical presence beneath the city. Bones sealed away remained intact. Bacteria slept in soil. The past waited. This chapter is not about the Black Death as an event. It is about its afterlife, about how panic reshaped burial practices permanently, teaching London that emergency measures could become permanent foundations. The plague did not need to return in flesh to haunt the city. It lived on in trenches beneath streets, in bones beneath churches, in the quiet knowledge that when death came too fast, London buried first and remembered never. And those pits, never meant to be revisited, would one day open again. At first, the plague pits were marked, not with reverence, not with poetry, but with simple necessity. A wooden post, a rough stone, a parish note scratched into a ledger meant for no one outside the church vestry. These signs were never intended to last. They were warnings, not memorials, signals to gravediggers and priests to tread carefully, to remember where the earth had already been pushed beyond its limits. But London does not respect temporary boundaries. Wood rots, ink fades, parishes merge, dissolve, and rename themselves. Clerks die. Records are lost to fire, flood, neglect, or deliberate destruction. Within a generation, many plague pits lost their names. Within two, they lost their meaning. By the time the Victorians inherited the city, most had lost even their location. This was not accidental. As London expanded, remembering became inconvenient. A marked plague pit limited development. It lowered property value. It raised uncomfortable questions. Better then to soften the language. Former burial ground. Old waste land. Unused field. The words changed first. The truth followed. Maps tell this story clearly when you know how to read what is missing. Early plans sometimes show empty spaces, oddly shaped plots with no explanation. Later editions smooth them over, replacing blank ground with neat rectangles of housing or straight lines of road. The absence of annotation becomes the annotation itself. What was once known is quietly erased. In some cases, the forgetting was deliberate. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, landowners petitioned to have burial grounds officially reclassified. Plague pits, especially those outside church authority, were declared non-consecrated or historically inactive. Once stripped of their status, they could be built upon legally. The dead beneath them were no longer protected, not by law, not by memory. The earth was treated as clean because the paperwork said it was. Builders encountered resistance only when something went visibly wrong. A foundation collapsed unexpectedly. A cellar flooded with black, foul-smelling water. Bones surfaced in numbers too large to dismiss as chance. When this happened, the response was swift and controlled. Remains were removed at night. Soil was replaced. Work resumed. No public record followed. What could not be seen could not threaten progress. For the poor, this forgetting was absolute. Plague pits filled with labourers, servants, and unnamed families left no descendants to protest, no wealth to preserve their memory. Their graves were easier to erase because no one claimed them. Entire communities disappeared beneath later streets, their only trace locked into the chemistry of the soil. The Victorians inherited not just forgotten pits, but a system designed to forget efficiently. Parish officials often could not say with certainty where older burial grounds lay. When asked, they relied on rumour, guesswork, or inherited warnings passed down without explanation. Avoid that corner. Dig shallow there. The ground turns bad after rain. Practical knowledge survived where official memory failed. This created a dangerous paradox. The city knew the dead were everywhere, but could no longer say precisely where. Engineers and surveyors worked around invisible hazards. Streets sagged without clear cause. Walls cracked where soil shifted unevenly. The dead were not evenly distributed, and the city above them reflected this imbalance subtly, quietly, over decades. To acknowledge the full extent of forgotten plague pits would have required something unthinkable: stopping, halting expansion, questioning the morality of building atop mass death. London could not afford such reflection. The empire moved forward. The city followed. And so the plague pits were not denied, they were normalized through silence. This chapter is about absence, about how forgetting becomes policy and silence becomes structure. By the Victorian era, London was not ignorant of its buried past. It was selectively blind. The plague pits had not vanished. They had simply been unmarked long enough for the city to convince itself they no longer mattered. But the ground does not forget what maps erase. And soon, the forgotten would begin to surface again. What lay beneath the church was never meant to hold so many. In earlier centuries, crypts were quiet spaces, stone chambers beneath sanctuaries, reserved for clergy, benefactors, or the exceptionally devout. They were places of prayer and contemplation, cool and dim, where the living might kneel close to the bones of the holy and feel comfort rather than fear. Death here was orderly, limited, and meaningful. That balance did not survive London's growth. As burial space above ground vanished, attention turned downward. The crypts were already there, walled, enclosed, consecrated. They offered privacy, permanence, and protection from disturbance. At first, their use expanded slowly. A coffin here, another there. A family vault widened, a chamber subdivided. No one imagined what these spaces would become. But demand does not pause for imagination. By the late 18th century, crypts across London had begun to change character. What were once sacred undercrofts became repositories, storage spaces for the dead. Coffins were lowered not for rest, but for containment. Wood replaced stone. Iron fixtures multiplied. Passageways narrowed as walls of stacked coffins rose on either side, leaving only thin corridors for the living to pass through. Air grew thick. The deeper crypts rarely dried. Moisture seeped through stone. Condensation clung to lids. Wood swelled and split. Lead-lined coffins, meant to preserve, instead trapped gases that slowly expanded, bowing panels outward until seams failed. When this happened, the smell was unmistakable, sweet, cloying, and heavy, lingering in the lungs long after one emerged into daylight. Still, the coffins kept coming. Church authorities sanctioned the practice because they had little choice. Burial fees sustained parishes. Refusing interment meant financial ruin. And so, crypts filled until they could hold no more, then were made to hold even more still. Coffins were stacked upright to save space. Smaller coffins were slid into gaps between larger ones. Children were placed wherever a cavity could be found. No prayers marked this compression. Only efficiency. Above, sermons spoke of resurrection and peace. Below, bodies pressed against bodies, wood against bone, in arrangements that bore no resemblance to rest. In some crypts, floors were raised repeatedly to accommodate new layers, lowering ceilings until the living stooped while walking through death. Church wardens knew the risks. Complaints were common: vergers falling ill, candles extinguishing themselves in stagnant air, parishioners refusing to attend services during warm months. Physicians warned of effluvia rising from below. Some churches attempted ventilation shafts, small openings drilled into walls in desperate hope that air might circulate. It rarely did. The crypts became sealed worlds, growing heavier each year. Once filled, they were rarely reopened intentionally. To disturb them was to release something uncontrollable. And yet, disturbance was inevitable. Repairs required entry. Structural failures forced inspections. When doors were opened after years of sealing, witnesses described scenes that stayed with them forever. Coffins collapsed inward. Contents merged. identity erased by pressure and time. The Victorians did not speak of this openly. To admit that churches, the moral centers of the city, had become warehouses of decay was intolerable. Better to treat crypts as sacred mysteries, inaccessible and unseen. Better to lock the doors and let silence do the work. This chapter marks a quiet transformation, not a single decision, but a gradual surrender. When the earth above could no longer absorb the dead, London turned inward into its foundations, into its churches, into spaces never designed for such burden. The crypts did not rebel. Stone rarely does. But they filled and filled and filled until the weight of what lay beneath began to press upward, into walls, into air, into the lives of those who prayed above them. And one day, the doors would open again. There was a time when to be buried beneath the altar was the highest honor a parishioner could receive. It meant proximity to holiness. To lie beneath the place where prayers were spoken, where communion was lifted, where the living gathered to plead for mercy, it was believed that such closeness would ease the soul's passage into eternity. Stone floors separated the sacred above from the silent below, and for centuries this arrangement felt orderly, even comforting. Then the coffins multiplied. As churchyards filled and crypts expanded, the space directly beneath the altar became increasingly valuable. It was central. It was consecrated. It was protected from casual disturbance. Families with means requested it specifically, and parishes rarely refused. One coffin became two, two became four. Soon, the space beneath the holiest point in the church was no longer symbolic, it was crowded. By the Victorian era, many altars rested above dense stacks of coffins arranged with brutal precision. There was no room for sentiment in these arrangements. Coffins were laid lengthwise, then crosswise, then upright when space demanded it. Larger coffins formed the base. Smaller ones, women, children, were slotted wherever gaps appeared. In some churches, the altar itself had been raised multiple times over the years, not for grandeur, but necessity. Each elevation marked another layer of the dead added beneath it. Stone absorbed the pressure. Wood did not. The weight of stacked coffins caused boards to bow and split. Nails loosened. Lids sagged inward under centuries of accumulation. What had once been distinct bodies began to merge not violently, but inevitably. Cloth decayed. Flesh softened. Boundaries dissolved. Identity blurred into mass. Above, the rituals continued unchanged. Congregations knelt unaware that inches below their feet lay not peaceful sleepers, but compressed remains arranged like inventory. Candles burned. Choirs sang. Children were baptized above chambers where air had not circulated for decades. The contradiction was complete and carefully ignored. Those who worked closest to the altar knew better. Clergy, vergers, and maintenance workers spoke quietly of odd sensations near the chancel. A heaviness in the air, sudden extinguishing of flames, a lingering odor that no amount of incense could disguise during warmer months. Some claimed the stone floor felt warm beneath their hands, as if heat rose from below, not fire, but fermentation. Doctors of the time warned of miasma, poisonous vapors rising from decaying organic matter. Whether correct in theory or not, the symptoms were real. Headaches, fainting, illness clustering among those who spent long hours near the altar. Yet acknowledging the cause would have required unearthing it. That was unthinkable. To disturb what lay beneath the altar would be to violate both faith and decorum. And so, instead of removal, concealment deepened. Stone slabs were sealed tighter. Access points were bricked over. In some churches, the precise location of altar crypt entrances was deliberately forgotten. New clergy arrived unaware of what lay beneath them, inheriting sanctuaries built on silence. The dead were no longer individuals here. They were load-bearing. This is the moment when burial crossed a line, when the dead were no longer placed near holiness, but used to support it physically. The altar stood not just on stone, but on generations compressed into structural necessity. The sacred depended on the buried, and yet no one spoke of it from the pulpit. To do so would unravel too much. It would raise questions about dignity, about faith, about whether sanctity could survive such proximity to decay. Better to speak of heaven. Better to let the altar remain elevated literally and morally, while the truth remained sealed beneath it. This chapter is about inversion, about how holiness came to rest on overcrowding, how the most sacred point in the church became the most burdened, and how, in Victorian London, the highest symbols of spiritual order were quietly propped up by a foundation of silent, compressed dead. The stone did not crack, but it remembered the weight. The first thing people noticed was the smell. Not always, not every day, but often enough to make it impossible to dismiss. It crept into the church quietly, slipping past incense and candle smoke, lingering in corners where sunlight never reached. A sweet, heavy odor, cloying rather than sharp, settled into pews, curtains, and clothing. Parishioners learned to recognize it instinctively, even if they never named it aloud. It was the smell of sanctity gone wrong. Victorian churches were expected to smell of wax, stone, old wood, and prayer. But beneath many sanctuaries, another atmosphere brewed, warm, damp, and stagnant. Crypts packed beyond capacity became sealed chambers where air barely moved and decay had nowhere to go. Gases built slowly, pressing upward through cracks in stone and mortar, escaping only in faint, unsettling traces. Incense was used liberally to mask it, so were flowers. Windows were opened even in cold weather. Yet nothing fully erased the underlying presence. It returned with heat, with rain, with pressure changes in the air. A church that smelled close was quietly avoided. One that smelled sweet was whispered about. The Victorians understood smell as danger. Long before bacteria were accepted as the cause of disease, bad air miasma was blamed for illness, and churches near overcrowded burial grounds or packed crypts were known to be unhealthy places. Clergy complained of dizziness during long services. Choir boys fainted. Congregants reported headaches that appeared only after time spent near the altar. No one wanted to draw conclusions. To acknowledge that sacred spaces were contributing to sickness would have meant confronting what lay beneath them. And what lay beneath was not just uncomfortable, it was morally destabilizing. These were not forgotten burial grounds on the outskirts of the city. These were churches, the heart of community life, places meant to protect souls, not poison bodies. And so, explanations softened. The smell was blamed on damp stone, on old wood, on poor ventilation, on weather, anything but the truth pressing up through the floor. Those who worked in the crypts knew better. Verger reports when they survive describe environments that felt alive in the wrong way. Air so thick it extinguished candles, moisture beading constantly on coffin lids, wood soft enough to indent under a hand. In some crypts, entire sections were avoided altogether, deemed unsafe to enter. Doors were sealed, not with ceremony, but with fear. Yet services continued above. Congregations sang hymns, while the air carried traces of centuries-old decay. Sermons spoke of purity, resurrection, and eternal rest, while the physical reality below contradicted every word. The contradiction became normal. The human capacity to adapt to ignore proved vast. In some churches, desperate measures were taken. Ventilation shafts were cut through walls, meant to allow foul air to escape discreetly. These shafts often did little more than redirect the problem elsewhere into vestries, stairwells, or neighboring buildings. Complaints followed. Adjustments were made. Silence resumed. No one asked how much was too much. The smell did more than discomfort. It reshaped behavior. Churches with persistent odors saw attendance drop quietly. The wealthy moved their burials elsewhere. The poor had no such choice. They continued to be lowered into crypts that could no longer breathe. This chapter is not about revulsion, it is about denial, about how a city trained itself to reinterpret warning signs as inconveniences. Smell is the body's oldest alarm system, an instinctive signal that something is wrong. Victorian London smelled death constantly and chose to sanctify it rather than confront it. The odor became part of the sacred atmosphere. And in that transformation, where decay was masked as reverence, where danger was disguised as tradition, the city crossed another threshold. The dead were no longer merely buried beneath churches. They were inhaled. They worked at night, not out of superstition, but necessity. Darkness softened outlines, swallowed sound, and made familiar ground unrecognizable. While London slept above its graves, men moved quietly through churchyards and burial grounds, with practiced hands and untroubled consciences. They were known by many names: body snatchers, sack, up men, but the one that lingered longest was the most unsettling of all: resurrection men. Their trade existed because the city demanded it. Victorian medicine was advancing, hungry for knowledge of the human body. Anatomy schools expanded, surgeons trained in growing numbers, but the law permitted only a handful of corpses for study each year, usually executed criminals, and far too few to meet demand. Science required bodies, London provided graves. The gap between the two became an industry. Resurrection men did not dig entire graves. That would take too long, make too much noise. They worked with efficiency born of repetition. A narrow trench at the head of a grave. A lever slipped beneath the coffin lid. Soil pushed back carefully. Rope looped beneath the shoulders. The body lifted vertically, leaving the coffin behind to collapse quietly. Earth replaced. Surface smoothed. By morning, the grave looked untouched. The dead vanished without disturbance. Plague pits and overcrowded churchyards made their work easier. In some places, bodies lay so shallow that effort was minimal. In others, grave soil had been turned so often, it offered little resistance. The resurrection men knew which parishes buried cheaply, which grave diggers could be bribed, which funerals produced fresh corpses worth the most. Speed mattered. So did freshness. A body newly buried fetched a higher price. Children were valuable for anatomy. The poor were targeted relentlessly. They had fewer protectors, fewer watchers, fewer resources to guard their dead. Families resorted to heavy coffins, iron cages called mortsafes, night watches by lantern light. None of it fully stopped the trade. Churchyards became battlegrounds. The dead were no longer safe in the ground, nor were the living comfortable above it. Fear spread not of ghosts, but of violation. The idea that a loved one might be dragged from consecrated soil and dissected under gaslight horrified Victorians more deeply than decay itself. Burial had been their last defense. Resurrection men shattered that illusion. Authorities responded slowly and reluctantly. Officially, the trade was illegal. Unofficially, it was tolerated. Medical schools wielded influence. Knowledge justified compromise. Bodies were removed quietly, delivered discreetly, and paid for without questions asked. The city benefited from the results: improved surgery, reduced mortality while pretending ignorance of the cost. The dead paid it. Resurrection men navigated a city already conditioned to ignore what lay beneath its feet. They exploited forgotten graves, erased markers, and unrecorded burials. Plague pits, in particular, were rumored to hold unclaimed bodies, older but abundant. Some men claimed to recognize plague soil by feel alone. Others avoided it entirely, fearing disease or discovery. Either way, the pits were no longer sacred ground. They were inventory. This chapter exposes a cruel symmetry. As London buried its dead carelessly, it taught others how to retrieve them efficiently. As crypts filled and churchyards overflowed, the distinction between rest and resource dissolved. Bodies became objects to be moved, sold, studied, and discarded again. The resurrection men did not create this moral collapse. They thrived within it. By the time laws finally changed, granting legal access to bodies through workhouses and hospitals, the damage was done. Trust had been broken. The ground no longer promised protection. The dead were vulnerable not just to time, but to commerce. And so, in Victorian London, even burial did not mean staying buried. The earth gave up its secrets to those willing to work in silence, and the city, once again, looked away. The ground began to misbehave. At first, it was subtle small things easily explained away. A churchyard path that dipped slightly after rain, a headstone that leaned where it once stood straight, a patch of earth that never seemed to dry, no matter the season. London was old, after all. Settling was expected. Stone shifted, soil moved. But this was different. In certain places, graves refused to remain sealed. Coffins buried years earlier rose closer to the surface as the earth beneath them compacted and collapsed. Wood rotted, lids gave way, and the contents pressed upward, drawn by gravity and pressure into spaces never meant to open again. After heavy storms, bones surfaced, washed free of soil, and exposed to daylight without warning. Church wardens grew accustomed to discreet cleanups. A skull discovered near a footpath would be quietly removed before morning prayers. A rib, unearthed by a dog, would be buried deeper without comment. These incidents were treated not as revelations, but maintenance issues. The dead had become part of the landscape, something to manage rather than mourn. In overcrowded burial grounds, the problem worsened each decade. Grave soil, turned repeatedly, lost its structure. It no longer held firm. Rainwater pooled and soaked downward, destabilizing layers below. Coffins collapsed inward, creating voids that caused the surface to sink unexpectedly. In some parishes, the ground rippled unevenly, rising and falling like a held breath. Families noticed. Mourners returned to graves only to find markers displaced, inscriptions tilted at new angles, the earth reshaped by forces no one admitted to understanding. Some swore graves had been disturbed. Others accused resurrection men. Often, neither was wrong. The ground itself was complicit. Beneath the surface, centuries of burial pressed against one another. Bones shifted as wood decayed. Layers compressed until older remains were forced sideways, upward, anywhere pressure allowed. The dead did not stay neatly where they were placed. They migrated through soil that had long since lost its ability to contain them. Victorian engineers encountered this instability everywhere. When trenches were dug for pipes or repairs, workers broke into burial layers with alarming frequency. Coffins appeared where no burial was recorded. Human remains spilled into open work sites, halting progress only briefly before removal and continuation. Official reports described these finds in vague language: organic material, old interments, former ground. Precision was avoided deliberately. To acknowledge how often graves surfaced would have been to admit how fragile the city's foundations truly were. London was expanding rapidly, building upward and outward, laying stone atop soil that could not support the weight because it was already full. Some streets sagged permanently. Residents complained of cracked walls and uneven floors. In districts built over old churchyards or forgotten burial grounds, houses settled unevenly, doors warped, windows misaligned. Surveyors blamed poor construction. Builders blamed damp. No one blamed the dead beneath the foundations. And yet, the pattern repeated too often to ignore. In rare cases, the ground failed spectacularly. Sections of burial yards collapsed inward, exposing layers of coffins stacked impossibly close together. Witnesses described seeing 3, 4, sometimes 5 layers of burials compressed into a space never designed for more than one. These incidents caused brief alarm and then swift suppression. Earth was replaced, walls rebuilt, silence restored. The Victorians feared disorder more than truth. Graves that would not stay closed were reminders that burial had ceased to be final, that the city's attempts to hide death had only delayed its return. The dead did not rise in stories or superstition, but they rose physically, persistently, through soil weakened by centuries of denial. This chapter marks a quiet rebellion of matter itself. The earth, overworked and overfilled, could no longer obey the rules imposed upon it. Graves reopened without permission, remains resurfaced without ceremony. The living were forced to confront, again and again, what they had tried so carefully to compress out of sight. London learned to step around these moments quickly, but the ground remembered every coffin, and it was not finished shifting. The sickness did not arrive with bells or omens. It came quietly, slipping into the city through places no one wanted to look: cellars, pumps, drains, and the dark, wet seams beneath the streets where water moved without permission. Cholera did not descend from the sky. It rose. By the early 19th century, London's underground had become a labyrinth of waste and burial layered together. Cesspits overflowed beside wells. Drains leaked into soil already saturated with centuries of decay. Plague pits, forgotten churchyards, collapsed coffins, everything the city had buried poorly now shared the same subterranean space as its drinking water. The Victorians did not yet understand bacteria. What they understood was fear. Cholera struck fast and without mercy. A healthy person could fall ill in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The body emptied itself violently, as if trying to expel something foreign and furious. Skin turned blue, limbs cramped and twisted. The dying begged for water that only hastened their end. Doctors argued. Clergy prayed. Officials blamed moral weakness, bad air, divine judgment. But the disease followed patterns too precise to ignore. It clustered around certain streets, certain pumps, certain low-lying districts where the ground never fully dried, places where burial grounds had once stood, places where crypts lay directly beneath buildings, their contents slowly dissolving into the soil. The dead were leaking into the living. Rainwater seeped through layers of decomposing remains, carrying organic matter downward into the same groundwater London relied upon to drink. Wells sunk decades earlier now drew from poisoned earth. Pumps delivered clear-looking water that carried invisible death. Families drank together and died together. Still, the city resisted the implication. To accept that cholera came from below would mean admitting that London's burial practices had poisoned its foundations, that the very act of hiding death had allowed it to circulate freely. Easier, instead, to believe in miasma, noxious vapors rising from the ground, bad smells causing sickness by mere presence. Smell became suspect. Water, strangely, did not. Churchyards were blamed again. Physicians warned that burial grounds emitted dangerous gases, especially when disturbed. Some were closed, others were not. The measures were inconsistent, cautious, half-hearted. Cholera did not care. It moved through pipes and pumps with indifference. In districts built over old burial grounds, death rates soared. Entire households vanished within days. Coffins followed quickly, lowered into the same compromised soil that had already failed so many. The cycle tightened. The underground grew heavier, wetter, more contaminated. A few voices challenged the prevailing belief. They pointed not to the air, but to the water, to pumps that served neighborhoods where cholera raged and spared those that did not, to patterns that followed underground flows rather than wind. These ideas were controversial, even offensive. They threatened long-held assumptions and, worse, they implicated the city itself. To accept them would mean digging deeper than anyone wanted, because beneath the water lay the graves, plague pits long forgotten, crypts sealed too tightly, churchyards reused until nothing remained intact. All of it shared the same underground space as London's drinking supply. The boundary between burial and daily life had collapsed completely. Cholera made that collapse visible. This chapter marks a turning point not in understanding, but in exposure. The city could no longer pretend that what lay beneath it stayed there. Death was circulating, not as memory or smell, but as sickness moving invisibly through the body of London itself. The underground was no longer passive. It had become active, mobile, and lethal. And, for the first time, the city began to realize that burying death poorly did not make it go away. It only taught it how to travel. The summer made everything worse. Heat settled over London like a lid, pressing down until the city could no longer breathe. The Thames slowed, thickened, and darkened beneath the sun, its surface barely moving, its banks slick with filth. What had always been unpleasant became unbearable. What had been ignored demanded attention. The smell rose everywhere at once. It crept into homes through open windows, clung to clothing, lingered in hair and skin. It followed people from street to street, from river to market, from churchyard to Parliament itself. No amount of perfume, vinegar, or incense could hold it back. London did not merely stink, it reeked of itself. The Great Stink was not a single event, but a revelation. It exposed what the city had allowed to accumulate beneath and beside it for centuries. The Thames, once a source of life, had become a slow-moving channel for waste. Sewage emptied directly into it. Industrial runoff thickened its flow, and beneath its banks, buried deep in the soil, lay generations of the dead plague victims, paupers, crypt overflow, forgotten churchyards, all contributing silently to the corruption. The river had become an extension of the grave. As water levels dropped during the heat, layers of sludge were exposed along the banks, black, glistening, and alive with decay. Gas bubbled to the surface. The smell intensified, heavy and sweet, unmistakably organic. This was not the sharp odor of refuse alone. It carried the same undertone parishioners recognized in overcrowded churches, the same note workers reported in sealed crypts. London was inhaling what it had buried. Members of Parliament fled their chambers. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung in desperate attempts to filter the air. Meetings were postponed. Papers reported on the stench with language that strained to capture its severity. The city could no longer pretend this was a local problem or a passing discomfort. The underground had reached the surface. What made the Great Stink so unbearable was not just its intensity, but its implication. The smell connected everything: river, sewer, burial ground, crypt, street. It made visible, through the senses, the system London had built beneath itself. Waste flowed into water. Water passed through soil heavy with human remains. Vapors rose. The cycle completed itself in the lungs of the living. And still, many clung to old explanations. Miasma was blamed again, bad air rising from corruption. The smell itself was feared more than its source. Yet even this belief carried an uncomfortable truth. The air was bad because the ground was wrong. The stink came from below, from places never meant to mix death and daily life, burial and consumption. Engineers began to understand what denial had postponed. The city's buried past was poisoning its present. The dead were not merely beneath London, they were part of its infrastructure. Plague pits lay near riverbanks. Old burial grounds drained into the same soil that fed the Thames. Crypts leaked slowly into surrounding earth. Everything converged in the water. The Great Stink forced action not out of compassion, but survival. Plans were drawn. Sewers were designed on an unprecedented scale. The goal was not to honor the dead, nor to confront burial practices directly, but to move the consequences elsewhere, to flush them away, downriver, out of sight. Progress, once again, meant displacement rather than reckoning. Yet even as new systems were built, the foundations remained. Sewers cut through burial layers, tunnels passed near plague pits, workers reported bones during excavations, skulls rolling into trenches, ribs tangled with brick and pipe. These discoveries were treated as inconveniences, not warnings. Construction continued. The stink receded. The city breathed again. But the great stink had done its work. It proved, undeniably, that London's buried secrets could no longer stay hidden, that the dead, compressed and forgotten, did not remain inert. They participated in smell, in sickness, in the very air of the city. This chapter is the moment when denial became impossible. For one long summer, Victorian London was forced to smell its own history. And once smelled, it could never truly be forgotten. There is a particular weight to a room filled with the dead. Not merely physical, though that is considerable, the crushing presence of centuries of bodies stacked in confined space, but something deeper, almost sentient, pressing on the senses, on the mind, on the soul. Victorian London inherited these spaces in every parish that had outgrown its churchyard, every chapel that had expanded beyond reason. Bone cellars and charnel rooms became a secret layer of the city, unseen, unspoken, and often ignored at peril. Charnel rooms were not made for comfort, they were storage. Stone walls enclosed narrow corridors lined with niches, coffins stacked 2, 3, sometimes 4 deep. Skeletons, long decayed, were cleaned, arranged, and stacked like timber. Some were set with care, skulls aligned, femurs laid parallel. Others were tossed in haste, evidence of hurried relocation or space-saving expedients. The air was dense, damp, and unmoving, carrying the faint scent of rot and the weight of history. Cellars beneath churches were no less grim. What had begun as a small crypt for a benefactor or a priest evolved over decades into a repository for any who could not be accommodated above. Coffins were layered atop one another until the floor bowed and stone lintels threatened to crack. Lime was scattered to slow decay, but its effect was minimal. Moisture seeped through masonry, softening wood and accelerating the inevitable collapse. Lead-lined coffins bulged under pressure. Sometimes lids split quietly, a subtle pop that echoed in the darkness. Few ventured into these spaces willingly. Verger, sextons, and the occasional curious worker knew to move quickly. Candles cast long shadows against walls covered with centuries of accumulated grime. The stone underfoot was uneven, and steps were often slippery from condensation. Mist formed from damp and warmth, coating skin and clothing. Every breath carried the smell of age and mortality. Even the most stoic felt it, the oppressive, almost animate awareness of bodies, compressed into an enclosed space. The dead were not always silent. Shifts in the soil, the slow settling of coffins, and the cracking of wood produced sounds, groans of compression, the creak of iron hinges, the faint rattle of bone against stone. In the darkness, imagination filled in the rest, whispering, shuffling, footsteps that were not one's own. Residents above occasionally reported odd drafts, sudden cold spots near the altar, or the faint impression of presence in a quiet church. These were often dismissed as superstition, but in the cellars themselves there was no need for imagination. The dead moved, ever so slightly, under the relentless weight of accumulation. Charnel rooms also served a practical purpose, grim though it was. As the city grew, it became impossible to bury all within the ground allotted. Bodies removed from shallow graves, displaced by new burials, found temporary refuge here. Families sometimes donated coffins directly to the charnel for storage until proper interment could be arranged. But more often, these were the poor, the nameless, or the unlucky swept into rooms where identification was minimal, if recorded at all. These spaces were lessons in denial. Above, congregations worshipped, sang hymns, and prayed. Below, centuries of London's dead lay stacked in ordered chaos. The sacred had become utilitarian, the holy, functional. The city ignored the ethics of compression, of concealment, of smell and sickness. The ground outside could not hold them, so the cellars did. And the cellars held their own secret truths, that death could be managed, but never fully tamed. This chapter is not about horror for its own sake. It is about the silent architecture of mortality, the layers of bones and coffins that supported not only church walls, but also the illusion of social and spiritual order. In Victorian London, the dead were not merely buried. They were contained, stacked, catalogued, and forgotten. But the cellars remembered everything, and in remembering, they became as real and present as the living above them. The poor had no choice. In the dense heart of Victorian London, every inch of space was contested above ground for housing, below ground for the living, and yet deeper still for the dead. Churchyards were crowded, crypts were full. Plague pits had long since been layered, pressed, and closed in hasty rows. For the city's poorest, burial meant something different: anonymity, proximity, and sometimes indignity. Paupers were consigned to mass graves, shallow trenches carved quickly into earth that would never be measured for formality or permanence. Families with means could afford vaults or lead-lined coffins. Those without were folded into communal earth, one body atop another, sometimes wrapped in nothing more than a coarse shroud. A small child next to an adult, a stranger beside a stranger, stacked in ways that made no distinction, offering no dignity. These were the graves London wanted to forget. They were often hidden behind fences, at the edge of fields, or in corners of churchyards never used by the wealthy. Sometimes they were located beneath streets that would later carry carts and carriages, their layers compressed by passing wheels. Builders and labourers learned to tread carefully or to ignore the uneven ground, pretending the rising lumps and depressions were natural. The bodies themselves were not silent. Rain seeped into shallow trenches, washing away soil, leaving bones exposed or partially buried. Rodents burrowed, wood splintered. In some cases, the living noticed fragments emerging along alleyways or courtyards. Workers often recoiled, but the city moved forward, indifferent. When a skull surfaced in a construction site, it was replaced quickly and quietly. No announcement, no ceremony, no trace beyond memory. Poverty dictated forgetting. The poor had no advocates. Their names were rarely recorded, their families too destitute to object. Death was one more burden, and the city relieved itself of responsibility by compressing them beneath pavements, pathways, and unused lots. Graves were not designed for preservation, only for containment. Space was at a premium, efficiency paramount. In some areas, multiple layers of pauper graves existed within a single trench, bodies stacked as though the earth itself were a warehouse shelf. This accumulation had consequences. Soil became unstable, buildings settled unevenly, streets sagged, and water collected in odd depressions. Sometimes smells rose, faint but unmistakable, in summer air. And though the rich were mostly insulated from these effects, the poor above them were not. Disease spread more readily where mass graves lay close to tenements. Cholera, typhus, and other epidemics found fertile ground in the water and soil above and beside these burials. Even in death, inequality persisted. Some paupers were interred with minimal ceremony, others not at all. Church authorities often insisted on closure of pits, but the ground could not accommodate the living and the dead simultaneously. The city compromised, stacking, pressing, and sealing bodies into earth that would never rest quietly again. It was an unspoken agreement, The poor would be buried cheaply, expediently, and forgotten. Yet the dead remained. Beneath the cobblestones, beneath brick houses, beneath the very streets themselves, the bodies of paupers pressed upward through centuries of compression. Every rain, every frost, every new foundation disturbed layers long considered inert. The city moved on, but the ground remembered, holding the traces of lives that mattered so little to those above. This chapter is a study in denial and survival. Victorian London prided itself on progress, on civilization, on order, yet it achieved these things at the cost of burying the poor in ways that were neither dignified nor permanent. The paupers beneath the pavement were both the foundation of the city's growth and a silent reminder of what happens when society values some lives over others. And the ground beneath them did not forget. The workhouse was meant to be a place of relief, a place to shelter the destitute, feed the starving, and provide employment for those who had no other means to survive. Yet, in Victorian London, it became something darker, a threshold where life and death collided, and the management of human bodies revealed the city's uneasy relationship with mortality. Inside the walls of these grim institutions, the poor were numbered, catalogued, and assigned tasks with rigid efficiency. Disease ran rampant: tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus. The workhouse was a crucible for sickness, and death was an expected companion. When bodies could no longer be sustained by food, medicine, or warmth, they were claimed quickly and quietly. The rules were simple: dispose, record minimally, and make room for the living. Burial was practical, not sacred. Workhouse administrators often had dedicated burial grounds nearby, or sometimes behind the same walls where the living had labored. Graves were dug swiftly, sometimes in rows that seemed more like storage than rest. The poor, the sick, and the unlucky were lowered into earth that had already borne many others. Coffins were minimal, sometimes nothing more than a wooden box without adornment or lining. Shrouds, if used at all, were coarse, and ceremony was considered a waste of time. The pace of death dictated efficiency. During outbreaks, multiple deaths could occur in a single day. Coffins were stacked in temporary storage, bodies placed atop one another until the grave was deep enough. Laborers worked silently, their hands steady, their conscience dulled by repetition. The living moved on above, often unaware of the layers accumulating beneath the soil. Workhouse records were vague, mechanical. Names, if recorded, were brief, and many were lost entirely, leaving graves as anonymous as the occupants themselves. Disease compounded the horror. Cholera, typhus, and influenza were particularly deadly in these crowded institutions. Water often flowed through contaminated channels, air was thick and unmoving, and ventilation was minimal. The dead added to the problem, their bodies contributing to miasma, or so the doctors of the time believed. Ventilation shafts, lime, and other measures were employed, but they were insufficient against the sheer volume of human mortality. The line between life and death blurred, and the living feared what lay beneath their feet as much as what lay within their walls. The city above ignored it, as it always did. Victorian London prided itself on progress, industry, and civility, but workhouse burials were reminders that social order came at a cost. Those with wealth and influence were insulated from the consequences. The poor bore them in both life and death. Burial beneath the workhouse grounds was a final lesson in hierarchy. The more powerless the person, the less visible their death, the cheaper their grave. And yet, even in these mass burials, the dead endured. Layers of bodies pressed against one another, compressing soil, displacing coffins, destabilizing earth in ways that would be felt for decades. When construction, expansion, or drainage projects intersected with these grounds, the dead surfaced unexpectedly. Skulls, bones, fragments of clothing, testimony to lives that had been minimized in death as they were in life. This chapter is a meditation on denial and control. The workhouse managed poverty, but it could not control the dead. It could stack, record, and conceal, but it could not erase. The bodies beneath its grounds became part of the infrastructure, part of the city's foundation, an unacknowledged layer upon which London would continue to grow. Here, death was both practical and permanent in its physical presence, even if memory of the dead was fragile, selective, and fleeting. In Victorian London, workhouses taught a cruel lesson. Death could be managed, but it could never be fully denied. And the earth beneath them remembered everything. The first rails cut into the earth like knives. They were narrow, gleaming, and cold, stretching across the city with an ambition that seemed limitless. But beneath the surface, London already held its history in compressed layers, centuries of burial, crypts overflowing, plague pits sealed hastily, paupers stacked beneath pavements. The arrival of the railway did not create these dead, it simply forced the living to confront them. Construction crews moved with urgency. Schedules could not be delayed for superstition, for unease, or for the complaints of the few who suspected what lay beneath the soil. The first shovelfuls of earth revealed fragments almost immediately, broken coffin lids, splintered wood, occasional bones. Work paused briefly, then continued. The dead were obstacles, not stories. They were obstacles to be moved, buried deeper, or carefully avoided while construction pressed onward. In the early days of railway expansion, accidents were frequent. Trenches collapsed into unmarked graves. Workers were struck by falling soil that concealed human remains, their presence known only by a fragment of rib or a decayed finger. Supervisors ordered silence. Bones were carted off at night, dumped in pits away from the city's gaze. Maps recorded streets and stations, not burial layers. The dead were removed without ceremony, as though erasure could absolve the living of responsibility. Churchyards were not spared. Many lay directly in the path of progress. Crypts were intersected by foundations, their walls shattered by picks and pulleys. The living above noticed subtle changes first. Uneven floors in homes built nearby, inexplicable sinking where streets had once been level, small depressions in the earth that could not be explained by ordinary settling. Those who had grown accustomed to the smell of mortality noticed it lingering near construction sites, sharper, closer, carrying whispers of disturbance. Some engineers knew the stakes. Archaeologists, when consulted, were rare and often ignored. The demands of commerce outweighed the concerns of memory. Legal frameworks were thin. Few protections existed for the burial grounds of the poor, and even church records offered little guidance. It was easier to assume that these bodies were anonymous, unclaimed, unimportant. In the pursuit of progress, the city excused itself from confronting what lay beneath. And yet, the dead asserted themselves in small ways. Railway tunnels flooded into old graves, loosening soil that had settled for decades. Coffins that had been compressed beneath layers of earth were dislodged, breaking apart when pressure was applied. Fragments surfaced during maintenance or collapse, forcing workers to deal directly with the physical consequences of past decisions. In some cases, bones were incorporated into embankments inadvertently, cemented into foundations of tracks meant to carry trains and passengers to the future. Public fascination grew, whispered stories circulated. Londoners spoke quietly of discovering skulls while digging cellars, of halting construction when a mass of human remains appeared. Ghost stories and superstition followed, but the practical reality was more insistent. The city above had built its arteries of progress directly over centuries of death. This chapter marks the collision of ambition and memory. Railways promised movement, connection, and modernity, but they also exposed the cost of hiding mortality. Each line driven into the earth reminded the living that the ground beneath them was not neutral. It held names, faces, bodies, and histories that demanded acknowledgement. Even buried deeply, the dead were not silent. They pressed upward into every foundation, every trench, every decision made in haste. Victorian London learned, slowly, that progress could not erase the past. The rails carried people forward, but they cut through memory itself. The city advanced, but on a foundation haunted by what it had buried and tried to forget. The dead travelled with every train, unseen passengers in a network built upon neglect, compression, and the weight of centuries. By the mid-19th century, London had learned that death could no longer be confined to the edges of the city. The living pressed outward and upward, consuming space that once belonged to the departed. Burial grounds had grown overcrowded, crypts overflowed, and plague pits pressed under streets and alleys alike. The city was choking, both above and below. It demanded a solution, and it found one in iron, steam, and schedule: the London Necropolis Railway. The railway was conceived as both practical and merciful. Bodies would be transported from the heart of the city to new burial grounds far beyond its boundaries: Brookwood, the so-called London Necropolis. Coffins would travel discreetly, removed from the eyes of the public, allowing London to continue living above ground without confronting the layers of death beneath its streets. At first glance, it was a triumph of engineering and logistics. Beneath the surface, it was something far darker. Stations were constructed to serve the dead: separate waiting rooms, platforms, and carriages distinguished between first-class and third-class passengers, an extension of the social hierarchy even in death. Wealthier corpses were afforded private carriages and attendants. Paupers were transported en masse, sometimes stacked in ways that mirrored the overcrowding that had long plagued the city's graveyards. The living supervised, the dead travelled silently. London could breathe above, while the Necropolis Railway carried its unwanted layers away. Yet the railway did not cleanse the problem, it only displaced it. Along the route, workers uncovered remnants of older graves, sometimes in direct conflict with planned tracks. Skeletons surfaced where the earth had been pressed too lightly over older coffins. Soil slumped beneath the weight of steam engines, disrupting layers that had rested undisturbed for decades. At stations, vaults built for temporary storage groaned under the pressure of massed coffins. Lead lids split, wood buckled. The smell of decay clung to walls and tunnels alike, resisting the antiseptic measures intended to mask it. The railway also highlighted the moral contradictions of Victorian London. The living preferred to remove the dead rather than reckon with them. Families consented or had little choice in order to secure burial space. Yet the distance of Brookwood made memorialization difficult, isolating the departed from those who had loved them. The city outsourced both death and remembrance. Profit, social order, and expediency triumphed over dignity. The Necropolis Railway became a moving repository of anonymity, carrying away not just bodies, but the accountability for how those bodies had been treated in life and death. Even the stations themselves bore a peculiar air. They were functional, but heavy with ritual. Coffins were loaded and unloaded with care, staff in somber attire, but the corridors were often filled with the faint stench of decomposition. The living avoided lingering. Visitors who had come to pay respects were guided swiftly past the areas where the dead were stacked for transport. The city's engineers, clergy, and attendants alike became complicit in a system that demanded efficiency over reverence. And yet, the railway could not erase what lay beneath London itself. Beneath streets, beneath houses, beneath old churchyards, bodies remained compressed in soil, pressing against one another as they had for centuries. The Necropolis Railway moved only what could be reached, only what families or authorities consented to. Plague pits, mass graves of paupers, and overcrowded crypts persisted in silence, unrelocated, unacknowledged, always pressing upward in subtle ways through sagging streets, unstable foundations, and odors that rose with warmth. This chapter is about displacement and denial. Victorian London sought to manage death with technology, to create order and remove unpleasant reminders. The Necropolis Railway was a marvel of its age, a symbol of control over mortality. But it also revealed the futility of such control. No railway could carry away the weight of centuries of hurried, overcrowded, and forgotten burials. No iron and steam could contain what had been pressed into the very soil of the city. The dead travelled, yes, but beneath the living they remained. And London, for all its ingenuity, learned that death cannot be fully transported, concealed, or ignored. The church had always promised sanctuary, but sanctuary has its limits. By the 19th century, Victorian London faced a paradox. Its sacred crypts, once carefully managed resting places, were overflowing. Coffins pressed against stone walls, lids bowed, wood softened with centuries of moisture. Air was still, thick with the weight of what it held. The living above continued their rituals, oblivious or willfully blind, while the dead below expanded their presence in ways that threatened both structure and health. Something had to give. Crypt clearances began quietly. The process was practical, efficient, and rarely discussed. Vaults were opened with care, but the care was technical, not spiritual. Coffins were removed systematically, sometimes to be relocated to new vaults, sometimes to be transferred to external cemeteries, and sometimes, particularly in cases of paupers, to be discarded in mass graves. Bones were sorted, stacked, and, in some cases, crushed to make room for the living. Each action was weighed against space, stability, and expense. Reverence was secondary, if considered at all. The living were not always present. Clearances were performed during off hours, often at night or during quiet periods, to avoid disturbing parishioners. Workers moved with experience, handling coffins with the mechanical detachment of someone accustomed to proximity with death. A fractured skull here, a broken coffin there, these were details, obstacles to be managed, not events to be mourned. Lime and other disinfectants were sprinkled to reduce smell, but they could not erase the impression of history pressed into stone and soil. For the wealthy, relocation offered dignity. Families could pay to have vaults transferred intact, their ancestors placed in newer, more stable locations, often in cemeteries that promised order and longevity. Lead-lined coffins survived the journey relatively intact. The names on inscriptions were preserved. The air above ground carried the illusion of control, of continuity. For the poor, the results were less considerate. Coffins were compressed or discarded. Bones were stacked in ways that obliterated identity. The dead became infrastructure, measured in inches and layers rather than remembered lives. Yet crypt clearances revealed what the city had long concealed. As coffins were lifted, workers encountered objects left with the dead: rosaries, coins, scraps of clothing, letters in fragile ink. Some were centuries old, pressed between boards and soil, preserved by darkness and compression. Skeletons told stories of malnutrition, disease, and trauma. A child's femur might be thin and brittle. An adult's pelvis could bear the signs of labor or injury. The crypts became archives of London's hidden history, though few acknowledged their content in full, and the smell persisted. Even with lime and ventilation, the air carried subtle traces of decay absorbed into walls and wood. Clergy complained of headaches, fainting, and nausea. Parishioners, too, sometimes noticed, though they spoke of drafts or humidity rather than the city's accumulation of death beneath their feet. The living adapted to discomfort, just as they had adapted to the weight and presence of the dead. Crypt clearances were never complete. Some chambers were inaccessible. Stone had shifted, floors had collapsed. Time had fused layers of burial into impenetrable masses. The city managed what it could, moved what it could, and ignored the rest. The dead remained pressing against walls, beneath floors, in the shadows that no candle could reach. In this way, Victorian London learned an uncomfortable truth. Clearance could not equal removal. History, compressed and layered, was stubborn. This chapter is about confrontation and compromise. Crypt clearances revealed that London's attempt to manage death was always incomplete. Space could be made, coffins moved, bones stacked or shifted, but the dead, and the history they carried, could not be fully erased. The crypts remembered every coffin, every burial, every failure of the living to anticipate the consequences of their overcrowded, hurried practices. And beneath the city, the weight of centuries pressed on, patient, silent, and inescapable. The earth has its own memory. It remembers every coffin pressed into its soil, every body compressed beneath its weight, every hurried burial made without ceremony. In Victorian London, that memory was not always gentle. Coffins broke open, not in vengeance, but in the inevitability of decay, weight, and time. And when they did, the city above could no longer pretend the dead were contained. It began subtly. A creak in the crypt, a shift in the soil, a floorboard that sagged where it had once been level. In some churches, parishioners smelled a faint, unfamiliar sweetness, an odor that was almost familiar, yet impossible to place. Builders and clergy brushed it off as dampness, mildew, or the city's characteristic gloom. But the truth lay beneath. Wood splitting under centuries of pressure, nails rusted and loose, coffins yielding to the relentless compression of layers above and around them. When a coffin broke open fully, it was rarely dramatic. Often, it was discovered during maintenance, construction, or relocation. A lid cracked along a seam, a corner splintered, and fragments of cloth, wood, and bone became visible. Workers reported it quietly, sometimes at night, so that parishioners would not see. In one case, a skull rolled slightly from its resting place when a stone slab above shifted. The verger hurried it back into shadow, replaced boards, and continued daily life as if nothing had occurred. The dead, however, had made their presence known. These incidents were not isolated. Across London, in churchyards, crypts, and burial grounds, coffins succumbed to time. Moisture softened wood, lead expanded and cracked. Iron fittings corroded. Pressure from neighboring coffins forced lids to bow, then split. The process could take decades or centuries, but the outcome was the same. The dead emerged into spaces they had never chosen, their concealment betrayed by the very forces that had been meant to contain them. The consequences extended beyond the immediate. When coffins broke open in shallow graves, the soil shifted, destabilizing the surrounding ground. Pavements above sank slightly. Foundations of nearby houses cracked. Wells and water channels sometimes carried traces of decay to places intended for drinking. Faint odors rose in warm weather, detectable to those sensitive enough or unlucky enough to notice. Panic occasionally spread among workers, though they were trained to act quickly, push the remnants back, recover the grave, and leave no trace for the living to see. Yet some coffins broke open in ways that could not be contained. During railway expansions, tunnels intersected old burial layers. Coffins cracked as pressure from heavy equipment compressed the soil. In one documented case, several skeletons emerged when a support beam shifted, forcing engineers to halt construction and summon parish officials to manage the unexpected exposure. Reports described the scene as overwhelming. The living confronted the physical manifestation of generations compressed beneath the city, and for a moment, the past refused to remain unseen. The breaking of coffins forced the city to reconcile with its own neglect. It was a reminder that hurried burials, overcrowded crypts, and mass graves were not inert. The weight of centuries pressed continuously on each coffin. Time, moisture, and gravity were relentless overseers. No matter how carefully the living tried to hide their dead, nature had its own method of disclosure. This chapter is about inevitability. In Victorian London, coffins breaking open were more than accidents. They were the earth asserting itself, the city's history pressing upward, and the dead reminding the living of the consequences of compression, neglect, and denial. No amount of wood, lead, or secrecy could permanently contain them. The city above could continue with its ceremonies, markets, and parades, but beneath the streets, the dead remained active in their silence and in their insistence on being remembered. The ground had long been thought to hold the dead securely, but it was a fragile confidence. In Victorian London, centuries of hurried burial, overcrowded churchyards, and sealed crypts had left the city teetering atop layers of human remains. Yet even the soil, pressed and layered, could not remain passive forever. Occasionally, the city was forced to confront what it had so carefully hidden. Plague pits, long sealed in panic and fear, were reopened. The pits themselves were unremarkable at first glance. Shallow depressions in fields or low-lying land, often far from the eyes of the affluent, marked the resting places of hundreds or thousands of bodies hastily interred during outbreaks centuries prior. Lime scattered over the surface masked both odor and decay. A rough fence might surround the site, if even that, and records were sketchy at best. Over time, nature attempted to reclaim the pits. Grass grew unevenly, soil settled in mysterious ways, trees spread their roots through the layers below. Yet when the city needed more space, these ancient graves became expedient once again. By the mid-19th century, the surge of population and persistent urban expansion forced parish authorities to revisit these long-forgotten grounds. Plague pits, once closed hurriedly, were now excavated to make way for new burials. Gravediggers descended with practiced hands, lifting the compacted earth, exposing layers of coffins long pressed together, and encountering bones fused with soil in ways that made separation both laborious and disturbing. Skulls sometimes fractured under the pressure of centuries, revealing fragments of garments, rosaries, or coins left with the dead in haste or hope. The workers treated what they found with efficiency, not reverence. Bodies were shifted aside to create space for new coffins, their identity erased in a single act of necessity. Even when the remains were relocated to other sections of the same churchyard, they were stacked further, compressed yet again. London's dead were being recycled, layered over and over, each generation of living pressing the previous one closer to the surface. And yet the dead remained potent. The air carried subtle traces of decay. Moisture rising from soil dampened the inside of coffins, accelerating wood rot and releasing odors that could not be masked entirely. Workers reported headaches and fainting spells. Parishioners above might notice the faintest, sweet scent in warm months, a reminder that beneath their streets and gardens lay the bodies of those buried in panic centuries before. Plague pits reopened did more than solve practical problems. They revealed the city's accumulated negligence. Each layer unearthed reminded the living of the crises they had inherited, the consequences of burial done hastily, of parishes stretched beyond capacity, of death treated as an inconvenience. The pits spoke in a language of soil, bone, and compression, demanding recognition even when law, custom, and propriety encouraged denial. For the poor, reopening was another indignity. Mass graves containing the bodies of paupers, servants, and the destitute were shifted without ceremony. They were moved to make space for new burials, often of those who had the means to pay for a plot, a coffin, or a marker. The dead were sorted by convenience rather than remembered as individuals. In the process, anonymity was reinforced and memory compressed further into the earth. This chapter is a meditation on the persistence of death. Plague pits, sealed in terror and intended to remain untouched, proved anything but permanent. Victorian London learned that the dead could be moved, stacked, and forgotten repeatedly, but they could not be ignored. The earth beneath the city retained its memory. Each reopening was both practical and moral reckoning, a reminder that what is buried in haste has a way of resurfacing, demanding attention even centuries later. The pits were reopened, but they never emptied. The living rarely ventured into the spaces where London's past pressed thickest, yet some did not for ceremony, not for devotion, but for science. Doctors descended into crypts, plague pits, and charnel rooms with lanterns and instruments, their steps careful, their breaths shallow. They came to study, to catalogue, to understand the human body in life and in death, unaware of how deeply the city's negligence had shaped what they would find. The crypts were oppressive, not merely from physical confinement, but from the weight of accumulated time. Coffins stacked floor to ceiling, pressed against walls, leaning as wood softened and metal fittings rusted. The air was humid, foul, and unnervingly still. Moisture seeped through stone, dampening clothing and instruments, carrying the faintly sweet odor of decay. Doctors wore gloves when they could, masks when they had them, yet the smell penetrated their senses, lingering in lungs, hair, and memory. Every inhale was a reminder that the dead were both present and pressing upward, refusing the distance the living so desperately sought. In plague pits, the situation was even more extreme. Doctors tasked with examining mass graves, often centuries old, encountered layers of compacted soil, interspersed with bone, shrouds, and fragments of clothing. The bodies had been buried in haste, sometimes stacked one atop another, limbs intertwined. The sheer weight compressed coffins and skeletons into a mass almost impossible to separate. Surgeons and physicians discovered that decomposition was uneven. Moisture, pressure, and time had acted differently on each layer. Some skeletons remained surprisingly intact, others had collapsed into dust and pulp. The work was gruesome, necessary, and morally ambiguous. Every incision, measurement, and note reminded the living that they were intruding upon spaces that had been intended to remain undisturbed. Records kept in journals reveal both fascination and horror. Doctors noted signs of disease lesions, deformities, malnutrition, but they also noted signs of human behavior. Bones arranged with care or hastily discarded, small tokens left in coffins, sometimes even letters pressed between planks. The dead were communicating across time in ways subtle and indirect, and the living could scarcely ignore it. Yet the city above remained largely unaware. Parishioners attended morning prayers, children played in churchyards, merchants walked streets, all oblivious to the examinations occurring beneath their feet. The act of scientific inquiry was tolerated precisely because it did not disrupt life above ground. Doctors had access, but public attention was deliberately diverted. Any appearance of scandal would have forced acknowledgement of a truth the city was unwilling to face, that the dead beneath London were too numerous, too neglected, and too compressed to remain safely hidden. The implications were profound. Physicians recognized that disease did not die with the body. Soil saturated with plague, typhus, or cholera could, and sometimes did, affect the living above. Contamination could rise through water, seep into foundations, or release odors that warned of what lay beneath. These doctors were among the first to connect the behavior of the dead with the health of the living, observing patterns that would later inform public health measures, sewer construction, and burial reform. This chapter is about confrontation and revelation. Doctors below ground acted as witnesses, translators, and chroniclers of London's hidden mortality. They encountered the city's accumulated dead not as symbols or abstractions, but as physical, persistent reality. Crypts, plague pits, and charnel rooms revealed the consequences of centuries of hurried burial and forgotten obligations. The living above continued in ignorance. but the ground below spoke clearly. Death had weight, history, and memory, and it could not be fully contained. In Victorian London, to study the dead was to confront the city itself, its failures, its compromises, and the relentless persistence of what it had tried to forget. The smallest among the dead were also the most numerous. Victorian London, with its dense streets and crowded alleys, was unkind to the young. Infant mortality was a shadow hanging over every parish, every home, every cradle. Disease claimed them swiftly, sometimes before they could even be named. Hunger, fever, and the lingering consequences of urban poverty left the youngest lives fleeting, and the city's response to their deaths was swift, practical, and merciless. Children were buried first, often without ceremony, in the spaces that remained between coffins of adults, at the edges of crypts, or in the margins of hastily dug graves. Their small bodies were sometimes wrapped in shrouds, sometimes placed in tiny wooden boxes, occasionally unprotected, and invariably stacked with others when space demanded it. Unlike the wealthy, whose children might receive ornate coffins or burial in vaults beneath the church, the poor were lowered into mass graves that already pressed against centuries of prior death. The dead became a continuum, and children were compressed alongside them. The physical reality was harsh. In crypts, coffins containing children were nestled wherever gaps appeared, sometimes with legs bent at impossible angles to fit beneath heavier lids above. The pressure from layers of adult coffins caused wood to splinter and crack. Moisture permeated the boards, accelerating decay. When a coffin collapsed, bones of the smallest, most delicate bodies mingled with those of adults, obscuring identity, obliterating the distinction of age, and creating a layered testimony to both life and neglect. Above ground, the living rarely noticed. Playful laughter echoed through churchyards where infants had been buried only days before, or sometimes years, and the soil itself bore no visible mark. Headstones, if present, were crude or generic. Records might note a child's death with a simple age and name, or sometimes nothing at all. Most children vanished from memory as completely as they had from life, leaving only the soil and the compacted layers beneath to record their existence. Yet, even in death, the presence of children was felt. Ground above burial layers shifted more unpredictably where infant coffins lay. Soil compacted unevenly, surfaces sagged, and in some places, stone foundations above leaned or cracked. Storm water carried traces of organic matter into cellars and wells, creating subtle but persistent health hazards. The smallest bodies exerted influence, despite their size, not through mobility, but through the inexorable pressure of their stacking, the decomposition of fragile bodies, and the interaction with surrounding earth. Victorian observers sometimes recorded the phenomenon with discomfort. Engineers, masons, and builders who encountered infant remains during construction were unnerved, though they quickly learned to treat them as material, not tragedy. Parish officials regarded them as routine. The dead were managed for practicality. Children's remains were folded into the infrastructure of the city with the same mechanical precision applied to adults. Their identity, dignity, and individuality secondary to the need for space. This chapter is about innocence compressed into earth. It is about how the city, in its relentless expansion and overcrowding, transformed the smallest lives into layers of memory pressed beneath streets and crypts. Children in the earth were at once most vulnerable and most enduring, delicate in body, yet persistent in presence. They served as a reminder that London's approach to burial was dictated not by sentiment, but by expediency, and that even the youngest could not escape the weight of a city unwilling to pause, mourn, or reckon with its own mortality. In Victorian London, children in the earth were silent witnesses, shaping the very foundations of the city above. Their lives, compressed and forgotten, became part of the soil itself, a quiet testament to loss, neglect, and the relentless persistence of death beneath a living metropolis. To touch the dead in Victorian London was to enter a moral labyrinth. The city above presented itself as orderly, progressive, and sanctified, but beneath the streets, in crypts, charnel rooms, and mass graves, the rules were less clear. Every disturbance, every coffin lifted, every bone shifted, every burial ground reopened posed not just a practical problem, but an ethical one. Who had the right to move the dead? Who could decide which bodies were preserved, which discarded, which pressed further into the earth? And who, if anyone, could judge the living for the choices made in panic, poverty, or necessity? The dilemma began with necessity. Burial space was limited. Churchyards were overflowing, crypts sagging under centuries of compression, plague pits pressed beneath the surface like hidden ballast. Bodies could not remain where they were. New deaths demanded accommodation. Clearing crypts, reopening plague pits, relocating coffins, all were required to maintain the functioning of the city above. In the name of order and progress, the dead were moved, stacked, and compressed again. Yet even necessity carried moral weight, and each decision about which remains to disturb or ignore was fraught with consequence. For the wealthy, ethics were negotiable. Families paid for vaults to be reopened, for coffins to be transferred, for remains to be preserved with care. The dead of fortune and status were treated as enduring, deserving, even sacred. Their names, faces, and social identity were protected. Those with means ensured that disturbance was managed with ceremony, records, and dignity. The city accommodated them. For the poor, the ethical calculus was starkly different. Mass graves, pauper plots, and unmarked burials were shifted without ceremony or acknowledgement. Bones were stacked mechanically, coffins broken down, remains compressed further into the soil. Records were minimal or non-existent. The city treated these bodies as infrastructure space to be used, obstacles to be managed. Ethics, in this context, was a question of efficiency rather than morality. Decisions were dictated not by right and wrong, but by necessity and convenience. Clergy and administrators wrestled privately with conscience. Sermons continued above, speaking of the sanctity of burial and the promise of resurrection, while below, wood splintered, lead expanded, and bones shifted under the pressure of centuries. Some feared divine judgment, worried that disturbing the dead, even for necessity, might carry consequences. Others rationalized, invoking practicality, the limits of space, or the demands of survival. Philosophy bowed to pragmatism. Moral hesitation was often secondary to the pressing needs of the living. The act of disturbance carried unforeseen consequences. Coffins cracked, exposing remains to air and decay in ways that invited disease. Soil destabilized, foundations sagged, and odors rose through floors and streets. Workmen and laborers sometimes fell ill, witnessing firsthand the hidden history of overcrowded, compressed death. Each act of relocation, each reopening of a grave, became a moral experiment as much as a practical one. How much disturbance was permissible? How far could necessity stretch before it became desecration? This chapter is about tension, the uneasy balance between survival and reverence, practicality and morality. Victorian London, in its relentless expansion and obsession with order, forced its citizens to make these decisions daily. Every cleared crypt, every reopened pit, every shifted coffin was a test of conscience. The city had learned to manage death without acknowledging it, but ethical responsibility did not disappear simply because practicality demanded it. In the end, the ethics of disturbance were written in silence. Few records survived, and fewer public accounts were ever made. Yet, the ground remembers. Every act of movement, compression, and concealment was absorbed into soil, stone, and timber. A quiet testament to the compromises, the fears, and the moral reckonings that defined London's relationship with its dead. Beneath the streets, the ethical questions linger still, pressing upward, unanswerable but undeniable. In theory, catacombs were spaces of the dead. In Victorian London, they became spaces for the living as well, though not by design or by choice. Narrow corridors beneath churches and cemeteries, once intended for the respectful repose of corpses, were co-opted, repurposed, and pressed into service as passageways, storage areas, and even hiding places when necessity demanded. The city had outgrown its surface, and the dead's domain merged with the practical needs of the living in ways that were rarely acknowledged. The catacombs were labyrinthine. Low stone ceilings, damp floors, and walls lined with coffins created passages that tested both courage and sanity. Air was thick and heavy, carrying the persistent odor of moisture, decay, and centuries of compressed human remains. Dust rose with every step, settled in the eyes, and clung to clothing. The lanterns carried by sextons and workers did little more than illuminate the immediate path. Shadows moved along the walls as if alive, and every echo footstep, drip of water, scrape of wood, amplified the sense of life, intermingling with death. The living were cautious. Only those with purpose ventured below. Workmen repairing foundations, clerics checking vaults, engineers rerouting sewer lines, or the occasional morbidly curious citizen guided by rumor. Each step through these corridors required attention. Coffins pressed against walls were sometimes stacked 3 or 4 deep, their contents long decomposed yet still exerting weight, and the stone floors were uneven, occasionally giving way to hidden voids created by collapsed burials. One misstep could disturb the resting dead, exposing bones that had lain silent for generations. In many ways, the catacombs became a city beneath the city. Pathways intended for bodies were now conduits for water pipes, gas lines, and pedestrian traffic for workmen. Tools clinked against iron hinges and wooden lids as workers navigated the corridors, often brushing against skeletal remains without pause. The living adapted quickly. Awareness became instinct. Touching a skull or stepping over a femur became routine, a mundane component of navigating a hidden world that most Londoners above would never see. Even the most devout clergy were not immune to fear. Tales circulated of shadows that moved independently, of faint whispers that seemed to echo from nowhere, of chill air that refused to dissipate even in the heat of summer. These were dismissed officially as superstition or explained by drafts. Yet the sensation of being watched or of having the weight of centuries pressing in was universal. Catacombs were functional, yes, but they were also psychologically oppressive. The living's presence altered the dead. Coffins were shifted to make room for foot traffic. Wooden lids splintered under repeated contact. Dust and moisture were disturbed, accelerating decay. In some cases, remains became exposed, forcing urgent responses to cover them lest they contaminate surfaces or air. The line between reverence and practicality blurred. Catacombs were no longer purely for rest. They were workplaces, passageways, and, at times, reminders that the dead were never as still as the city above imagined. This chapter is about coexistence under duress. Victorian London had no choice but to share space with its own history, to navigate passages built for the dead while advancing life above. The catacombs illustrate the city's layered reality. Commerce, religion, survival, and mortality interwoven in tight corridors of stone and shadow. They were, in effect, catacombs for the living, pressed into service in a metropolis that could no longer afford to ignore what lay beneath. The dead remained patient. The living moved among them cautiously. And London, as always, pressed forward, unaware, and perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the weight of what accompanied every footstep through those hidden corridors. The slums of Victorian London were a place of unrelenting density, narrow alleys, and buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder as though trying to escape the weight of their own expansion. Poverty was tangible here. Children in tatters, mothers bent with labor, men coughing from damp air and coal smoke. Above it all, the city lived its bustling life, but beneath these streets, the ground carried a heavier burden. Bones lay in quiet testimony, pressed into the soil like the hidden infrastructure of neglect. The poor had always paid for space differently. Burial in slums was rarely orderly. Churchyards were too far or already full. Crypts were reserved for those who could afford them. Plague pits had long since been layered beyond recognition. And so, the dead were interred wherever the earth could be pried open, often in shallow graves, sometimes in corners behind buildings, sometimes in courtyards that doubled as playgrounds by day. Children, adults, and the elderly alike were compressed together, layers pressed by soil, footsteps, and the foundations of future tenements. Construction, expansion, and maintenance continually disturbed these graves. Slum buildings, built quickly and cheaply, often sat atop former burial plots. Foundations shifted, cellars collapsed. Water seeped into the earth, washing soil away and exposing fragments of the dead. Residents occasionally stumbled upon bones while digging for coal, repairing basements, or creating rudimentary drains. The discovery was alarming, but practical solutions, quick reburial, removal at night, covering with new soil, prevailed over ceremony. The city had learned to prioritize the living over the sanctity of the dead. Bones beneath the slums told stories the city tried to ignore. They revealed malnutrition, disease, and trauma. Skeletal remains bore the marks of violent labor, injury, or illness conditions that shaped the lives of the living above. Children's skeletons were small, fragile, sometimes missing teeth that had rotted before death. Adults were often emaciated, their bones thin and brittle. Every burial reflected the hardships of life above ground: overcrowding, hunger, exposure, and the constant specter of disease. Odors, too, reminded residents of the buried presence beneath them. Moisture rose from earth, carrying faint traces of decay into basements and cellars. During heat waves, the smell intensified, mingling with the stench of refuse and sewage. Londoners adapted, but the olfactory memory remained. Visitors noted it with discomfort. Residents learned to ignore it. The bones pressed silently beneath their feet, influencing health, architecture, and the rhythm of daily life without recognition. Even the city's reformers struggled to respond. Public health initiatives could attempt sanitation, sewer construction, or relocation of cemeteries, but the slums were dense, poorly mapped, and resistant to change. Bodies remained, compressed and layered, a permanent testament to past neglect. Each intervention revealed more remains, reminding reformers that the city's foundation was built as much on human debris as on brick and mortar. This chapter is about invisibility and endurance. The slums, crowded and impoverished, masked both the living and the dead. Bones beneath their streets carried the history of suffering, of systemic neglect, and of life compressed by space, poverty, and disease. Victorian London thrived above, oblivious or indifferent to the persistent weight beneath. Yet the earth remembered. Every step, every foundation, every disturbance echoed centuries of bodies that had once lived, struggled, and died. In this way, the bones beneath the slums were more than remnants. They were witnesses. They were the silent architects of the city's limitations, the invisible measure of human endurance and vulnerability. And they remained, patient and unyielding, beneath a city that rarely looked downward. London had long been a city familiar with death, but epidemics transformed that familiarity into terror. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, and, most devastatingly, cholera swept through streets and alleys, indifferent to wealth, status, or hope. Each wave left bodies in its wake, and each wave compounded the pressure beneath the city. The dead were buried quickly, often in mass graves, and with each hurried interment, the foundations of London became layered with history, disease, and decay. Burial practices adapted to necessity, not to safety. Epidemic victims were sometimes placed in designated plots, hastily dug at the edge of churchyards or in fields deemed marginal. Lime was sprinkled, shrouds wrapped hastily, and coffins pressed into earth without ceremony. Sometimes, entire families were interred together, stacked in rows, the living's grief subordinate to speed. In the poor districts, these mass graves became routine. The ground itself seemed to absorb the urgency, compressing layers of human remains until it became difficult to distinguish one life from another. The disease did not remain confined to the dead. Corpses buried hastily in overcrowded graves could, and did, affect the living. Soil saturated with bodily fluids carried residual pathogens. Water tables, shallow wells, and drainage systems sometimes became contaminated, especially in districts where sanitation was already inadequate. During cholera outbreaks, the connection between burial practices and disease transmission became painfully evident. Families who thought they had secured final rest for their loved ones inadvertently contributed to the spread of illness. The dead, in their compressed and hastily managed graves, were vectors long after their breath had left the world. Doctors and public health officials began to recognize patterns. Certain streets, certain parishes, and certain water sources were repeatedly associated with outbreaks. They traced the spread of disease not only to the living conditions above ground crowding, filth, inadequate ventilation, but also to the invisible accumulation of corpses beneath it. Plague pits and mass burials, intended to contain the dead, instead became reservoirs of contamination. Yet authorities were limited in their ability to act. Relocating graves was costly, time-consuming, and socially fraught. Moving the dead risked exposing what the living preferred to forget. Even in supposedly safe areas, buried epidemics persisted. Crypts beneath churches, once sanctuaries, became complicit in the spread of disease. Corpses layered over centuries created stagnant pockets where air barely moved. Moisture penetrated coffins and tombs, mixing with decomposing remains, creating environments where bacteria could thrive. Miasma theory, popular among Victorian physicians, attributed sickness to bad air. But the underlying truth, bodily fluids seeping into soil and water, remained hidden in plain sight. The dead were not just inert matter. They were active participants in the city's cycles of sickness. This chapter is about consequence. Buried epidemics remind us that death is never entirely passive, that the layers beneath a city are not inert but alive, in effect. Each mass grave, each hurriedly dug pit, each compressed coffin carried more than memory. It carried pathogens, decay, and the inevitability of recurrence. London's streets, its houses, its alleys, and its watercourses were built atop this hidden reservoir of mortality. The living went about their days, often unaware, while the buried epidemics pressed upward, influencing health, structure, and the very rhythm of life. In Victorian London, the dead were never entirely gone. They were pressed into the soil, layered beneath pavements and alleyways, silently shaping the city and its people. Epidemics were both a symptom and a consequence of the city's choices of how it buried, of what it ignored, and of the compromises it made in the face of relentless mortality. The ground remembered, and the living paid the cost. The dead were meant to rest. That was the promise, the assumption, the silent agreement between the living and the earth. Yet in Victorian London, that promise was tenuous at best. Coffins compressed in crypts, bodies stacked in mass graves, and plague pits sealed in haste did not remain inert. The city learned, often too late, that death beneath its streets could reach upward, influence the living, and carry illness in ways subtle, insidious, and sometimes deadly. It began with smell. The living noticed it first, the faint, sweet tang of decay that surfaced during heat waves, rising from crypts or poorly covered graves. In homes near overcrowded churchyards, Basements carried odors that clung to walls and clothing. Streets themselves seemed heavier during summer, a subtle oppression that pressed into lungs and senses. The educated, the curious, and the fearful recognized the correlation. Sickness appeared where the dead were numerous, buried shallowly, or disturbed. Children fell ill first, followed by adults, in patterns that baffled conventional wisdom but spoke plainly to experience. Miasma theory offered explanation. Doctors and natural philosophers attributed epidemics to bad air rising from decomposing matter. It was not entirely wrong. Foul odors did correspond with disease, but it was incomplete. The dead influenced the living not only through smell but through water and soil. Shallow graves, poorly drained crypts, and collapsed coffins allowed bodily fluids to seep into groundwater. Wells, pumps, and channels used by residents could carry contamination, invisible and insidious. The city above moved confidently, unaware that its drinking water was a conduit between life and death. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox were particularly unrelenting. Victorians noted clusters of infection near older burial grounds, but the connection to decomposing corpses was uncomfortable to acknowledge. To admit that the earth itself had become a vector was to confront centuries of mismanagement, overcrowding, and disregard. Parish authorities, clergy, and engineers preferred easier explanations: weather, season, moral failing, overcrowding above ground. Yet the ground was neither passive nor forgiving. Bodies pressed by soil, compressed by subsequent burials, and disturbed by construction or excavation, continued to interact with the living in ways both predictable and deadly. Workhouses, slums, and pauper plots were hotspots. Here, death was rapid, burial was hasty, and decomposition was accelerated by density and damp. Children's remains mingled with adults, bodies were stacked in layers, and coffins were often imperfectly sealed. Residents above suffered the consequences. Epidemics flared repeatedly in these areas, moving swiftly through families and neighborhoods, leaving behind a trail of both sorrow and evidence. Even the wealthier districts were not immune. Buried epidemics had a way of crossing boundaries when water tables and soil chemistry aligned unfavorably. This chapter is about the interplay between neglect and consequence. The dead did not remain in the earth out of respect. They were active participants in the ecology of the city. Every mass grave, every overcrowded crypt, every improperly buried coffin had the potential to reach upward, influencing health and mortality in subtle and frightening ways. Victorian London could attempt to sanitize the surface, to improve water and sewage systems, to mask the odors with lime or ventilation. But the accumulated dead remained persistent beneath, pressing upward in both literal and symbolic weight. In this chapter, we see a city confronted with its own choices. The living went about their routines, blind to the influence of those buried below. The dead, in contrast, were fully present, shaping, altering, and reminding London that burial was never neutral, and that the earth beneath a city is as much a participant in life as in death. In Victorian London, to ignore the dead was to invite them to affect the living in ways unavoidable and enduring. London is a city of contradictions, and nowhere is this more evident than in its attempts to reconcile life with the persistent weight of death. As churchyards overflowed and crypts became crowded beyond capacity, the city faced a problem that required both ingenuity and denial. What to do with burial grounds that were full, decaying, or otherwise unusable? The answer, seemingly simple, was to transform them quietly, carefully, into gardens. Yet beneath the greenery, beneath the neat paths and manicured lawns, the earth retained the dead, layered in silence, compressed by centuries of burial and neglect. The process began with practicality. Older churchyards, especially in central London, were considered hazards to health. Bones pressed near the surface contributed to miasma, while shallow graves threatened to collapse under foot traffic or building foundations. Parish authorities, municipal planners, and public health officials concluded that greenery could mask both smell and danger. They landscaped, leveled, and planted, converting the grim familiarity of the graveyard into a space that appeared orderly, restful, and safe. Shrubs, flowers, and trees were used to cover uneven ground. Paths and benches created the illusion of a park. Yet the dead remained. Beneath the cultivated soil, coffins pressed against one another, charnel layers lingered, and mass graves continued to bear the weight of new burials atop old. Lime, intended to accelerate decomposition and control odor, could only do so much. Rainwater infiltrated layers of compacted earth, moisture collected beneath tombstones, and gases from decay occasionally escaped, mingling subtly with the air above. Visitors strolling through the gardens might notice an inexplicable dip in a path, a hint of unpleasant scent after heavy rain, or the sudden cold of ground that should have been warm in the sun. These were traces of the past, asserting itself against the city's attempts at concealment. The transformation also carried social implications. Gardens were designed for the living. Families could picnic, children could play, couples could stroll, anyone could enjoy a semblance of peace above what was never meant to be disturbed. Yet, these spaces were layered with inequality. The dead of wealthier families were often relocated to new cemeteries or maintained in vaults, while the bodies of the poor were left beneath the gardens, anonymous and compressed. Playful footsteps traversed centuries of unremembered lives, and the living interacted daily with the dead without acknowledgement. Engineers, landscapers, and laborers were acutely aware of the challenges. Shifting soil, adjusting drainage, and planting required understanding of the buried layers beneath, lest graves collapse or tombs be exposed. Sometimes during construction, workers unearthed skeletons, coffin fragments, or remnants of shrouds, forcing hurried concealment. Each discovery reminded the living that beauty and utility above ground could not erase what lay below. The gardens were a veneer, a deliberate masking of both mortality and mismanagement. This chapter is about illusion and persistence. Victorian London sought to create order, civility, and aesthetics where chaos and decay had long dominated. Gardens were symbols of progress, of gentility, of control over death. Yet beneath every path, beneath every hedge, beneath every flower bed, the dead remained, unyielding and patient. The city could walk, play, and admire, but the earth remembered. Graveyards turned gardens were more than landscaping, they were a compromise, a statement of denial, and a testament to the tension between life above and death beneath. The living could enjoy the illusion of order, but the dead, compressed in layers, continued to exert their silent presence, shaping the city in ways that time, soil, and greenery could never fully erase. London is a city built on memory and forgetting, but in its oldest districts, forgetting often outweighs memory. Churchyards, once the focal points of spiritual and communal life, were quietly abandoned as the city expanded, streets and buildings pressing against sacred ground until some parcels of earth were neglected, mismanaged, or erased entirely. Forgotten churchyards were not simply empty spaces, they were layered with centuries of burial, disease, and human desperation, compressed beneath the very city that had turned its back on them. In the early Victorian period, parish churchyards in central London had long since reached capacity. Gravestones leaned at impossible angles, inscriptions wore smooth with rain and soot, and the earth itself had begun to swell and settle unevenly, bearing the weight of repeated interments. Families who could afford it relocated remains to vaults or cemeteries farther from the city. But for the poor and unrecorded, the graves remained where they had been hastily placed. Over time, many churchyards fell into disuse. Walls crumbled, gates rusted, trees grew unchecked, grass overtook uneven mounds. The living walked past, often unaware that beneath their feet lay generations compressed into soil that had long forgotten its own limits. These forgotten spaces became repositories not just of the dead, but of the city's neglect. Plague pits, hastily sealed during centuries of epidemic, were layered beneath ordinary burials. Children, paupers, and unnamed laborers rested alongside wealthier parishioners, their anonymity ensured by haste and social hierarchy. Coffins collapsed under pressure. Lead expanded and fractured. Wood rotted, and bones pressed against one another in ways that would challenge the most skilled anatomist. Even without disturbance, these churchyards were unstable, their layers a hidden architecture of mortality. As the city expanded, forgotten churchyards were often built upon, partially leveled, or incorporated into new streets. Foundations dug for houses, shops, and alleys occasionally broke through centuries-old graves. Workmen discovered skulls, femurs, and fragments of coffins, prompting hurried removal and quiet replacement. Parish authorities rarely recorded these events. The living preferred to smooth over the evidence, covering history with pavement and brick. And yet, the soil retained the weight and arrangement of what had been buried, pressing upwards subtly through floors, walls, and foundations. The physical and social implications were intertwined. Forgotten churchyards were often located in poorer neighborhoods, where oversight was minimal, and the dead had no advocates. Rainwater collected in depressions, washing soil into cellars and basements. Odors rose during heat waves. Disease, though not always directly linked to burial, spread more readily where soil was saturated with decomposing bodies. The dead shaped the living environment even as they were ignored. This chapter is about disappearance and persistence. Forgotten churchyards reveal the duality of London's approach to mortality, the desire to maintain civility, appearance, and progress above ground, and the simultaneous indifference to what lay beneath. These spaces were not neutral, they were layered with history, neglect, and consequence. Every collapse, every odor, every disturbance reminded the living that the city's foundations were inseparable from the lives and deaths it had attempted to erase. In Victorian London, to forget a churchyard was not merely to erase a grave, it was to engage in ongoing denial of mortality itself. Beneath walls and hedges, beneath streets and homes, the dead remained, patient, compressed, and entirely unwilling to be ignored. The city above could flourish, but the earth beneath remembered, holding the record of every life buried, every plague endured, and every failure to honor the dead. London prided itself on order, on progress, on civilization, but its management of death revealed the limits of its morality. The poor laws, designed to provide relief and oversight for the destitute, dictated the lives of the living, yet their influence extended far into death as well. In Victorian London, these laws shaped not only who survived, but who could rest, where, and how. For the poor, burial was neither sacred nor guaranteed. It was a function of law, economics, and expediency. Under the poor laws, parishes were responsible for the dead of their inhabitants. If a pauper died without means, the parish bore the cost of interment. Burial in these circumstances was swift and unceremonious. Mass graves, shallow pits, and shared plots became standard practice. Bodies were stacked with efficiency rather than reverence. Lime was scattered to mitigate odor. Wooden coffins, when used at all, were thin and cheap. No markers were carved, no records preserved beyond the minimal notes required for accounting. To the city above, the poor's death was administrative. To the earth, it was a layer in a growing archive of unacknowledged lives. The poor laws also exacerbated overcrowding in burial grounds. Parish budgets were limited. The expense of preserving crypts, vaults, or churchyards for generations was impossible to justify. Every burial had to be managed efficiently, and reuse of graves became routine. Bones were shifted, coffins compressed, and soil pressed further down to make room for the next. Plague pits, pauper graves, and forgotten crypts were reopened, consolidated, or leveled. The city learned to treat its poorest dead as a resource to manage, rather than individuals to honor. Yet even within this system, death carried consequences for the living. Soil in which multiple bodies were compressed became unstable. Foundations of nearby buildings sagged, cellars flooded. Water and waste moved unpredictably through overburdened ground. Disease, cholera, typhus, and other epidemics followed these underground pathways. The poor laws ensured that the living above paid, often unknowingly, for the city's mismanagement below. The dead exerted influence beyond their silence, shaping streets, architecture, and public health outcomes. The laws also created moral tension. Clergy, parish officials, and physicians recognized the indignity imposed upon the dead. Many worried about divine judgment. Others rationalized. Necessity dictated expedience. The city could not afford to honor every life equally, and legal obligation was the closest approximation of morality available. Yet, the juxtaposition was stark. Wealthy families ensured elaborate tombs and private vaults, while paupers were lowered into communal soil, anonymous, compressed, and layered beneath generations of similar neglect. The poor laws codified inequality in death as surely as in life. This chapter is about power, responsibility, and the silent consequences of bureaucracy. Death under the poor laws was mediated by law, not conscience. Burial was a transaction, a body managed, a cost accounted for, a parish ledger balanced. The dead were displaced, anonymized, and compressed into earth that bore both literal and moral weight. Every mass grave, every reopened pit, every layered coffin was a record of the city's priorities, its social hierarchy, and its willingness to ignore the dignity of the powerless. In Victorian London, the poor laws ensured survival for the living, but dictated the fate of the dead. Beneath streets, homes, and markets, the dead remained pressed into the soil, layered and patient. The law dictated their burial, but the earth remembered their presence. The living might measure morality with ledger and statute, but the ground held the true reckoning. The city above was noisy, chaotic, and alive with commerce, conversation, and the constant rhythm of industry. Carriages rattled over cobbles, horses' hooves echoed off walls, and the voices of merchants and labourers carried across crowded streets. Yet beneath it all, London held another chorus, a silent, persistent presence that spoke not with sound but with pressure, smell, and subtle disruption. The dead, layered in crypts, plague pits, and churchyards, had their own voices, and those who worked closest to them sometimes listened. Workers in crypts, charnel rooms, and mass graves quickly learned that the earth beneath London was not inert. Coffins shifted under the weight of soil above. Wood creaked. Nails loosened. Skulls rolled slightly when disturbed. Moisture seeped into walls and floors. The dead were communicating in a language that was physical rather than verbal, demanding acknowledgement through tremors in the ground, odors in the air, and unexpected collapses. Sextons, gravediggers, and builders became fluent in this language. A sagging stone, a sudden damp spot, a tilt in the coffin lid, all were signs to be read carefully. Letters, diaries, and oral accounts from the period provide glimpses into how the living perceived these voices. One parish clerk described a groaning under the stone when opening a vault that had been sealed for decades. A labourer recalled bones shifting and settling as if breathing beneath the feet. Physicians noted that crypt air caused fainting and nausea among staff, an effect they attributed to miasma, yet which also hinted at the persistence of what lay below. Even children reported strange sensations near burial grounds, sudden chills, the feeling of being watched, and shadows that seemed to move independently. These impressions were dismissed by many, yet persisted in memory and in the city's collective unease. The voices were not uniform. They varied with age, density, and placement. Plague pits were different from pauper graves, which were different from family crypts. In mass graves, multiple generations pressed together produced unpredictable soil shifts and subtle vibrations when trodden. Crypts of wealthier families, tightly sealed, leaked little, but still radiated moisture, smell, and the pressure of compressed coffins. Each layer, each coffin, each body contributed to a chorus that could be sensed if one knew how to listen. Even burial practices amplified these voices. Reopened graves, shifted coffins, and displaced remains introduced instability. The dead, disturbed and recompressed, left traces above ground. Sagging earth, cracked pavement, uneven foundations, and faint odors carried through walls and pipes. Londoners might notice anomalies, an inexplicable draft in a church, water pooling in odd places, a floor that creaked beneath weight, but rarely connected them to the past. Those attuned to the city's underworld, however, understood that these signs were more than accidents, they were communication. This chapter is about listening and awareness. The voices from beneath were subtle, persistent, and undeniable for those who worked in proximity to them. They reminded the living that death is not merely the absence of life, but a presence with consequence. London's expansion, its reforms, and its ambition could not silence what lay beneath. In Victorian London, the dead spoke continuously. They communicated through soil, wood, and air, through odor and vibration, and through the subtle distortions they imposed on the city above. Those who ignored them did so at their peril. Those who listened learned to interpret the language of compressed bones and disturbed earth. The voices from beneath were patient, persistent, and relentless, ensuring that the city never entirely escaped the weight of its own mortality. The past does not remain buried forever. Victorian London learned this in subtle ways, first through sagging streets, through odors, through the occasional accidental uncovering of a coffin. But in the decades that followed, modern discoveries made the city confront what it had long tried to ignore. Archaeologists, engineers, and laborers digging for new infrastructure began to unearth layers of human history preserved beneath streets, buildings, and churchyards. Each find was a reminder that London's dead had a persistence beyond legislation, memory, and even urban expansion. Construction projects revealed the scale of the forgotten city beneath. During sewer and railway expansions, workers discovered human remains in startling quantities. Skeletons emerged where no map or record suggested burial. Coffins cracked open from pressure and age, spilling wood and bone into excavated trenches. Sometimes, entire layers of graves, plague pits, pauper plots, or overcrowded churchyard burials were exposed at once, revealing hundreds of individuals compressed together in the earth. The scale was overwhelming, even for those accustomed to Victorian crypts and charnel rooms. The city above, accustomed to its own sense of order, was forced to acknowledge the invisible past beneath. Modern science transformed these discoveries from curiosity to documentation. Physicians and anatomists examined remains to understand disease, malnutrition, and mortality in historical populations. Skulls bore evidence of trepanation or injury. Bones revealed deformities caused by poverty, labor, and disease. Microscopic analysis, chemical testing, and early forms of radiography allowed the living to see what had been compressed and forgotten. Each skeleton, each fragment, became both a historical record and a moral indictment, a reminder of how the city's dead had been managed, neglected, or discarded. Some discoveries were accidental, others intentional. Ground surveys for new housing or streets often exposed coffins. Archaeological excavations for historical research deliberately targeted older burial sites. In either case, The dead could no longer be ignored. Parishes and municipalities scrambled to respond, removing remains carefully when possible, reinterring them in new cemeteries, or documenting them before relocation. In many cases, however, records remained incomplete, ensuring that some individuals remained anonymous, their identity absorbed into mass history. The discoveries also challenged Victorian and modern assumptions about mortality and urban planning. Engineers found that soil saturated with decomposed remains affected foundations, water flow, and drainage. Builders discovered that even centuries-old crypts could shift or collapse under pressure. Urban planners had to account for the hidden presence of the dead when designing streets, buildings, and transportation systems. The city above, once confident that the past was buried, realized that it had built atop a network of living memory in earth and bone. This chapter is about revelation. Modern discoveries forced London to confront the consequences of centuries of hurried, overcrowded, and unequal burial. Crypts, plague pits, and churchyards revealed themselves not only as sites of death, but as active participants in shaping the city above. The earth retained memory, structure, and influence. The dead continued to interact with the living, silently asserting their presence through misaligned pavements, disrupted soil, and unanticipated exposure. In Victorian London and in the city that followed, the past could never remain hidden. Every shovel, every tunnel, every foundation unearthed the consequences of previous choices. Modern discoveries reminded the living that burial is not merely an act of placement, but a responsibility, and that the dead, once pressed into the earth, retain a presence the living cannot ignore. Archaeology, in Victorian London, was rarely the leisurely pursuit of antiquarians, examining ruins or collecting curiosities. Beneath the streets, in churchyards, crypts, and plague pits, it became an excavation of unease, a study not just of history, but of human mortality compressed into soil and stone. Every shovel unearthed not only bones, but also the city's anxieties, its failings, and its refusal to reconcile with the consequences of its own expansion. Excavations revealed layers of life compressed into death. Mass graves from cholera, typhus, and earlier plagues were pressed together with a precision dictated by space rather than ceremony. Skeletons of adults leaned against those of children, coffins collapsed into one another, lids bowed under the relentless pressure of soil and later burials. Archaeologists, when called to examine these sites, noted the complexity of arrangement, an inadvertent testament to the city's attempts at containment. The dead were both subject and object, silent yet insistent participants in the narrative of the city. The fear archaeologists confronted was multidimensional. Physical, because the soil itself was unstable. Shifting earth threatened tunnels, trenches, and temporary platforms. Tools struck fragments of wood and bone, sending splinters into the air. Moisture oozed from soil, dampening clothing and accelerating decomposition. Chemical odors rose, sweet, pungent, and suffocating, reminding even the experienced that the dead were not inert. The fear was also moral, for every layer uncovered revealed the consequences of neglect, hurried burial, and inequity. Poor children, paupers, and the nameless crowded together beneath well-to-do parishioners, their anonymity preserved only by silence. Every discovery carried lessons in epidemiology. Victorian doctors and later archaeologists noted signs of disease on bones, lesions indicative of smallpox, rickets from malnutrition, healed fractures revealing lives of labor and hardship. Epidemics, compressed into soil with generations of the dead, left evidence for those willing to read it. The very arrangement of mass graves, overcrowded, hastily covered, repeatedly reused, offered insight into how the living above had understood, and often mismanaged, the spread of contagion. London itself became an open-air laboratory of fear and consequence. its dead providing data in a language of bone and decay. These excavations also carried a psychological weight. Workers described chills, inexplicable drafts, and the sensation of presence. Shadows in candlelight seemed to move independently of those holding the lamps. Some claimed to hear subtle groans, shifts, or whispers when soil gave way. It was as if the city's dead were communicating not in words, but in resistance, in the physical assertion of their existence. Each finding reminded the living that neglect was never final, that attempts to bury, compress, and conceal had consequences that demanded recognition. The archaeology of fear was, at its core, a confrontation with London's past and present simultaneously. It exposed not only the methods of burial, but the moral and societal choices behind them. Every skeleton revealed a life lived under constraint, a death met with expediency, and a society willing to overlook the dignity of those without voice or wealth. The ground itself became a ledger of human neglect, pressed into stone, soil, and bone, awaiting rediscovery. In Victorian London, archaeology was not merely about understanding the past, it was a reckoning. The dead, long forgotten and carefully concealed, asserted their presence through earth and artifact, through smell, collapse, and layered decay. Every excavation reminded the living that beneath the streets lay not just history, but consequence, and that fear was an integral element of understanding a city built upon its dead. London, with all its grandeur and industry, appeared steadfast above ground. Streets stretched in orderly lines, bridges spanned the Thames, and the ceaseless rhythm of commerce continued without pause. Yet beneath its surface, the city told a different story, one of compression, pressure, and slow, inexorable movement. The dead, layered in crypts, plague pits, pauper graves, and forgotten churchyards, pressed upward with centuries of accumulation, and the earth itself began to betray the living. London was sinking, not catastrophically, but imperceptibly, a subtle reminder that the foundations of life were shared with the weight of death. In slums and poorer districts, the effects were most visible. Pavements shifted unevenly, forming gentle waves across streets that had once been level. House foundations settled unpredictably, causing doors to jam and windows to misalign. Cellars and basements flooded with water that had seeped through saturated soil, often carrying traces of decomposed remains. Residents, accustomed to discomfort, adjusted. Yet for engineers, surveyors, and builders, the phenomena were alarming, requiring constant monitoring, reinforcement, and adjustment. Every new structure had to account for the hidden legacy beneath. The phenomenon was cumulative. Each layer of burial, each coffin compressed by soil or subsequent interment, added weight. Lime scattered over plague pits slowed decay but could not relieve pressure. Crypts, designed for limited capacity, had been overfilled. Mass graves stacked bodies to the ceiling. Paupers, children, and the nameless occupied the same space, indistinguishable beneath layers of soil, boards, and stone. Over centuries, the earth compacted under the relentless weight, shifting gradually, settling unevenly, and creating instability that could be felt centuries later. Even in wealthier districts, the city sank. Beneath grand townhouses and church vaults, crypts pressed against foundations. Lead-lined coffins expanded with humidity, exerting subtle but constant pressure. Soil saturated from rainfall shifted unpredictably. Engineers discovered that drainage systems and sewer lines had to be carefully calculated to accommodate not just water, but centuries of human remains pressing against earth and masonry alike. Victorian London was a metropolis perched precariously atop its own mortality. The sinking was not violent, but it was persistent. It was measured in millimeters over decades, yet it affected everything. Streets required resurfacing, foundations needed underpinning. piles were driven deeper into earth already compromised by compressed bones. Even the simplest urban planning became an exercise in patience and concession. Architects and builders learned to expect movement, to design with the inevitability of compression in mind, and to acknowledge that the city itself was not a neutral stage, but a participant in the narrative of its dead. This chapter is about the invisible consequences of neglect. London's sinking reminds us that death, once pressed into earth, exerts influence long after bodies have ceased to breathe. The living may construct streets, build houses, and expand neighborhoods, but the accumulated dead beneath remain active forces in the city's physical structure. Foundations shift, soil gives way, and subtle tremors echo centuries of burial, reminding the living that their progress is always balanced atop mortality. In Victorian London, the city itself became a testament to the persistence of the dead. Every sagging street, uneven pavement, and leaning building bore witness to the compression of centuries, the consequences of overcrowded burial, and the unyielding pressure of mortality. The metropolis thrived, but it did so precariously, always resting atop the memory, weight, and persistence of those who had been buried long before the city learned to measure the cost of its own expansion. London had learned a delicate art, the art of containment, not containment of life, nor of commerce, but of death. Churchyards, crypts, plague pits, and pauper graves were stacked, compressed, and sealed with an efficiency born of necessity and denial. Yet even in their apparent repose, the dead were active participants in the city's history, exerting subtle influence on soil, foundations, and the very consciousness of the living. To understand why the dead stay buried, or perhaps why they appear to, is to understand the layers of management, neglect, and ritual that defined Victorian London. Sealing the dead was both practical and symbolic. In church crypts, coffins were arranged carefully, lids fastened, walls reinforced. Lime was scattered to slow decomposition. Mass graves were covered with fresh soil, tamped down to prevent sinking, and often landscaped to disguise the underlying horror. Plague pits, hurriedly filled during centuries of epidemics, were leveled and sometimes paved over, their presence recorded minimally or not at all. By controlling the physical layers of burial, London's authorities sought to control the memory of death itself. But the earth is patient. It remembers. Even sealed, coffins bow under pressure, lids crack, and soil shifts with moisture, frost, and the weight of centuries. Crypts sag, pavements ripple, cellars flood. Occasionally, construction or excavation disturbs layers that had seemed stable for decades, reminding the living that burial is never a final act. It is a negotiation with gravity, decay, and the persistence of matter. In this sense, the dead stay buried only because the living maintains the illusion. The earth supports the weight, but does not conceal the consequences. Ritual played a role as well. Burials were often conducted with solemnity. Prayers, shrouds, candles, and incantations provided a sense of order. Even minimal attention to placement, aligning coffins, stacking bodies with care served to create stability. Religious oversight reinforced the perception that the dead were resting properly. When parish authorities documented interments, even minimally, it provided a record that allowed oversight of disturbance. The living cultivated the idea that what had been buried could remain undisturbed, yet this perception depended entirely on human intervention. Pragmatism was equally essential. The dead were moved, compressed, and shifted to make room for the living. Paupers were interred with expedience, crypts were overfilled, plague pits were reopened. Each act of practical management reinforced containment, ensuring that the dead stayed in place long enough to prevent widespread disruption. Even in workhouses, where bodies were stacked for space rather than ceremony, maintenance and surveillance ensured that decomposition did not compromise foundations, pathways, or adjacent structures. The dead were kept buried by oversight as much as by soil, yet the permanence was never absolute. London's buried dead were a living system in miniature, subject to moisture, pressure, disease, and disturbance. They pressed against one another, influenced the city above, and revealed themselves in unexpected ways: odors, shifting soil, collapsing floors, or bones uncovered during excavation. Their presence was constant, and their burial required continuous management, vigilance, and a willingness to confront what was beneath. This chapter is about the tenuous balance between permanence and vigilance. The dead stay buried in Victorian London not because death is contained, but because the living maintains it through ritual, record-keeping, soil management, and careful oversight. The earth holds them, the city accommodates them, and both collaborate to preserve the illusion of rest. Yet the past is patient, and the consequences of neglect persist, waiting to rise, subtly, insistently, beneath the streets, houses, and crypts of a city built atop centuries of compressed mortality. In the end, the dead remain buried only because London chooses, day by day, to keep them so, and because beneath every street and structure, the layers of memory and matter press in silent reminder. Burial is never final, and the earth remembers everything. Stories have a way of growing from the soil itself, and in Victorian London, many of the city's most persistent tales began not in imagination, but in experience. Alleyways, streets, and houses that straddled former churchyards, plague pits, or overcrowded crypts became fertile ground for whispers of ghosts. The living, walking atop centuries of compressed dead, interpreted the subtle disturbances, the sagging floors, the strange odors, the creaking wood, as the voices of those who had never truly been allowed to rest. Ghost stories were not merely fiction. They were the echo of history pressing upward through the city. In slums and tenements, residents frequently reported the inexplicable: doors that opened and closed without wind, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, shadows that shifted independently of light. In the wealthier districts, servants and housekeepers whispered of drafts and cold spots near crypts or beneath floors, linking them to family vaults that had been sealed for generations. Even skeptics noted oddities: uneven settling of foundations, small tremors beneath floorboards, faint, sweet odors after rain phenomena that could be explained physically, but which the imagination readily ascribed to restless spirits. These stories had roots in reality: coffins collapsed under centuries of compression, shifting soil, and moisture. Bones pressed against walls and floors, sometimes puncturing the wooden planks that had once contained them. Crypts overflowed, mass graves settled unevenly, and charnel rooms pressed against foundations in ways that could subtly alter the behavior of buildings above. Any slight movement, soil compressing under a footstep, air shifting through ventilation cracks, a door responding to subtle changes in pressure, became material for tales of haunting. The living interpreted these physical disturbances as supernatural, giving voice to the dead that the city had long tried to silence. The content of these stories reflected the social order of burial. Paupers' graves beneath slums produced tales of restless children, faint cries at night, and shadows seen in alleyways. Wealthier districts, with their sealed crypts and family vaults, inspired visions of spectral ancestors appearing to warn or guide. In each case, the ghostly narrative was a response to the awareness, conscious or not, that beneath the city lay compressed, forgotten lives. The dead were not gone. Their presence was felt physically, morally, and psychologically. Priests and parish officials often dismissed such stories, attributing them to superstition, imagination, or hysteria. Yet even they were not immune. Verger and sexton accounts occasionally hint at unease: the sensation of weight pressing downward in crypts, the faint sound of shifting coffins, or odors that could not be explained by decay alone. Ghost stories in this sense were a language of the dead, a way for centuries of burial, compression, and neglect to be interpreted by the living. This chapter is about interpretation and acknowledgement. Ghost stories in Victorian London were not mere entertainment. They were rooted in the physical reality of overcrowded graves, unstable crypts, and forgotten burial grounds. They reflected the city's moral and practical compromises, translating the pressures, odors, and subtle disturbances of compressed death into narratives the living could understand. In a city built upon its dead, the ghosts are literal as well as figurative. They are echoes of neglected lives, compressed soil, and hasty interment. They remind the living that beneath every street, every home, every alley, the city carries its history, its failures, and the enduring presence of those it tried to forget. In Victorian London, ghost stories were the voice of the buried, speaking softly but insistently through the cracks, shifts, and shadows of a city that had never fully respected its dead. Records, ledgers, and maps are the city's attempt to preserve order. Yet in Victorian London, what was never recorded often spoke the loudest. For every grand vault, every well-kept churchyard, and every meticulously inscribed tombstone, there existed countless burials that left no trace beyond soil, memory, and the faint echo of a life once lived. These unrecorded dead paupers, children, migrants, and the nameless victims of epidemic formed the hidden infrastructure of the city, shaping both its physical and moral landscape without acknowledgement. The failure to record was rarely intentional. Parish clerks, sextons, and workhouse administrators were overburdened, constrained by budgets, and pressed for time. Epidemics, sudden deaths, and mass casualties required expedient burial, often in unmarked graves or shallow pits. Plague pits were layered haphazardly, crypts overflowed, and coffins of the poor were stacked with little attention to documentation. Paperwork was minimal, names were abbreviated, ages were estimated, and often no record existed at all. The living wrote what they could, and the rest was left to earth and memory. Yet these unrecorded dead were far from silent. Beneath the city, they influenced soil stability, water flow, and even disease transmission. Mass graves, when left unmanaged, contributed to shifting foundations, uneven pavements, and unexpected flooding in basements and cellars. Water percolated through decomposing layers, carrying the residues of human life into wells and channels. Bodies pressed against one another, wood decomposed under weight, and coffins collapsed in silence. The unrecorded dead exerted force in subtle ways, reminding the living that absence of documentation did not equal absence of presence. The psychological impact on those who did encounter these layers was profound. Builders, laborers, and clergy who stumbled upon unrecorded remains often felt an uncanny tension, a mix of shock, awe, and guilt. A fragment of bone discovered in a foundation, a child's skeleton unearthed beneath a pavement, a dislodged coffin in a cellar, all demanded immediate management. They were reminders that the city's past was neither tidy nor entirely controllable. The unrecorded dead challenged assumptions about permanence, ownership, and dignity, revealing the human cost of hurried interment and social inequity. This invisibility also reflected societal priorities. Wealthy families ensured careful records and maintained vaults. Their dead were visible, celebrated, and acknowledged. The poor, on the other hand, were compressed into anonymity, their identities stripped by necessity and neglect. Mass graves were unmarked, crypts were reused without notice, plague victims were buried en masse with no acknowledgement beyond the ledger line stating the number of bodies interred. The city, in essence, chose which lives were to be remembered and which were to vanish quietly into soil. The unrecorded dead remind us that history is partial and mediated. Maps, registries, and ledgers capture only what the city deemed worth noting. What was never recorded forms a counter-history, one of neglect, compression, and persistence beneath the surface. These silent layers exerted influence on architecture, public health, and even urban planning. London's living streets, pavements, and structures were shaped as much by what was buried and forgotten as by what was documented and celebrated. This chapter is about absence as presence. The unrecorded dead of Victorian London were an invisible city within the city, pressing upward through earth, affecting life above, and reminding the living that memory and record are not equivalent to reality. Beneath every street and building lay histories never written, lives unacknowledged, and consequences quietly endured. In this way, what was never recorded became the city's most persistent, insistent testimony. Victorian London thrived above ground, a city of commerce, innovation, and relentless expansion. Streets teemed with life, markets echoed with voices, and factories belched smoke into the skies. Yet beneath the surface, the city was a testament to compromise, a sprawling, layered compromise between the living and the dead, between necessity and morality, between social order and human cost. Every street, alley, and building rested upon centuries of hurried burials, overcrowded crypts, and forgotten plague pits, a foundation built not solely on brick and stone, but on compressed human lives. The compromises began in life and extended into death. The poor laws dictated who received care and who did not. Paupers were buried quickly, without ceremony, often in mass graves at the edges of churchyards or beneath streets and alleys where expansion had claimed space. Wealthier families could pay for vaults and lead-lined coffins. The poor were stacked in layers, pressed into soil already saturated with the dead. Church authorities, constrained by limited space and parish budgets, made pragmatic decisions to move old coffins, compress graves, or reopen plague pits. Every choice reflected compromise, balancing the needs of the living above against the dead below, and the practical against the ethical. Crypts were similarly compromised. Built initially for clergy or benefactors, they became repositories for the dead of multiple generations. Coffins were stacked, lids bowed under weight, wood splintered, and lead expanded. Lime and ventilation mitigated decay, but could not eliminate it. The living maintained an illusion of order while the dead were compressed, rearranged, and, in many cases, forgotten. The very sanctity of sacred spaces was negotiated constantly against the demands of population, mortality, and spatial limitations. Even public health measures were compromises. Epidemics forced hurried burial, which in turn created conditions for future outbreaks. Shallow graves, saturated soil, and disrupted plague pits carried contamination into water supplies and air, spreading disease despite the city's best efforts. Sewer systems, drainage, and ventilation were designed to protect the living, but the presence of centuries of compressed dead complicated every plan. Architects, engineers, and physicians recognized the consequences, but solutions were always partial, temporary, or postponed another compromise in a city perpetually balancing growth with mortality. The compromises extended into memory and record-keeping. Wealthy deaths were documented and memorialized. The poor, the unclaimed, the victims of epidemics were often left unrecorded. Cemetery maps omitted mass graves, parish records abbreviated or anonymized burials. The city's history was written selectively, reflecting not reality but convenience, control, and social hierarchy. Beneath the streets, however, the truth remained unaltered. Layers of human remains pressed against each other, pressing upward in subtle ways that affected foundations, pavements, and architecture. This chapter is about negotiation, restraint, and the uneasy balance that allowed Victorian London to flourish above ground. Every compromise between ethics and necessity, wealth and poverty, life and death was recorded not in ledgers but in the soil beneath. The city's expansion, its streets, its buildings, its health policies, and its social hierarchies were all shaped by the buried dead. In the end, Victorian London was a city built on compromise. Every foundation rested on decisions made to accommodate both the living and the dead, often favoring expediency over morality, convenience over reverence. The living continued their lives above, believing in order, progress, and stability, while beneath, the consequences of compromise accumulated, pressing upward silently, invisibly, persistently, a reminder that no city can thrive entirely without reckoning with the weight of its own mortality. The streets of modern London appear ordinary. Tourists wander past pubs, shops and squares, marveling at architecture and history, unaware that beneath their feet lies a vast, layered city of the dead. Cobblestones, asphalt, and concrete obscure centuries of burial, from pauper graves in shallow soil to the hasty interments of plague victims to the carefully stacked coffins of crypts long sealed. The city moves confidently above, yet the earth below remembers every layer, every compression, every act of hurried interment, demanding acknowledgement in ways subtle, persistent, and occasionally undeniable. Walking above former plague pits is an act layered in ignorance. Beneath roads and sidewalks lie bodies stacked and compressed, lime scattered to mask decay, soil tamped to prevent collapse. Rainwater shifts these layers unpredictably, causing minor collapses, uneven pavements, and weak foundations. To the passerby, these irregularities are mundane inconveniences: a sunken curb, a cracked wall, a floorboard that creaks for no reason. Yet they are physical echoes of centuries of neglect, of hasty burials, and of the city's compromise with death itself. Every step above carries weight, not only of the living traffic, but of compressed histories beneath. Churchyards that appear serene and landscaped are equally deceptive. Beneath the manicured lawns and gravel paths lie graves of the anonymous poor, stacked coffins of children and adults, and layers of epidemic victims pressed into soil with no ceremony. The living stroll past memorials to the wealthy or notable, often oblivious to the anonymous layers around them. Even when markers exist, they cannot convey the sheer density of the dead. Subtle shifts in the ground, a slight sag, uneven growth of grass, moisture pooling after rain signal the presence of compressed remains, an invisible grid of mortality etched into the city. Modern construction occasionally exposes these layers. Excavations for utilities, subway lines, or renovations unearth fragments of coffins, bones, and shrouds. Archaeologists and engineers pause, assess, and often rebury quickly, following laws that protect some remains but leave others vulnerable. These interruptions are reminders that, though centuries have passed, the dead retain influence. Foundations settle differently, water infiltrates basements, and subtle odors rise after rain. The past, though invisible, communicates through the ground itself. Even in daily life, the presence of buried epidemics persists. Water tables, soil compaction, and underground contamination influence city planning and public health in ways that remain largely hidden. Foundations are reinforced, drainage systems carefully routed, and land surveys conducted to avoid the consequences of layered graves. Yet these precautions are imperfect. The earth beneath retains memory. It responds to weight, moisture, and disturbance. London moves forward above ground, but it remains tethered to the dead below. This chapter is about awareness and humility. Modern Londoners navigate streets, parks, and squares confident in progress, convenience, and order. Yet every step above former burial grounds is a silent acknowledgement of the past. Walking above the pits today is an encounter with history compressed into soil, a reminder that even in the absence of record or ceremony, the dead shape the city in tangible ways. Pavement, street, and building rest upon human lives layered, pressed, and preserved beneath. In Victorian London and beyond, the city above cannot escape the city below. Every step, every foundation, every excavation tells the story of hurried burials, social hierarchy, epidemics, and compromise. The living move above with confidence, but the dead remain patient, insistent, and unmoving, shaping the city quietly, persistently, and eternally. London has a memory that is buried beneath its streets, alleyways, and foundations, and it is a memory that does not forget. The city above thrives with the bustle of commerce, the clang of iron wheels on cobbles, and the chatter of pedestrians, yet beneath it, the earth holds the imprints of centuries of mortality. Crypts, plague pits, pauper graves, and mass interments press into soil that has long since ceased to be neutral, retaining the weight, arrangement, and consequence of every life that has been buried within it. This is the ground that remembers, and it bears witness to the compromises, neglect, and urgency of generations past. Every layer of soil beneath London tells a story. The wealthy were interred in lead-lined coffins, their names etched in stone, preserved with care. The poor were stacked in mass graves, their anonymity ensured by expediency and necessity. Children were pressed alongside adults, epidemic victims alongside those who died slowly of poverty. Lime and earth masked decay, but they could not erase the physical reality, the compressed bodies, the shifting soil, the subtle forces pressing upward against foundations and pavements. The earth remembers every coffin, every shroud, every hurried interment, and its memory is expressed through the subtle signs that disturb the living above. The dead communicate through absence as much as presence. Uneven streets, sagging pavements, and cracked foundations hint at what lies beneath. Damp cellars, inexplicable drafts, and faint odors after rain speak of soil saturated with centuries of compressed human remains. Construction crews unearthing coffins or bones during renovations confront the persistence of the past directly. Every excavation, every measurement, and every disturbance reveals the weight of history that Victorian London and its successors chose to compress, relocate, or ignore. The city moves above these layers, but they shape it invisibly, inexorably. Even when burial sites were landscaped, repurposed, or converted into gardens, the ground retained its memory. Mass graves under lawns, overcrowded churchyards beneath paths, and crypts beneath foundations continued to exert subtle influence. Roots twisted through coffins, soil shifted with water, and gases released during decomposition subtly altered air quality. The living might see beauty and order above, but the buried dead remained active participants, shaping both physical infrastructure and the psychological awareness of those who dwelled above. This persistence is moral as well as physical. Victorian London's burial practices reflected compromise between ethics and necessity, status and poverty, life and death. The city's expansion relied on hurried interment, layered graves, and selective memory. Yet, these choices had consequences. The ground retained them, pressing upward, reminding every generation that mortality cannot be entirely controlled, forgotten, or contained. The dead are silent, but the soil itself holds testimony of their presence. This chapter, and this work, concludes with reflection. The ground remembers what the living attempt to bury, ignore, or deny. Beneath every street, every alley, every building, there is a layered city of the dead, compressed, persistent, and insistent. Victorian London built itself atop compromise and mortality, and the echoes of those choices endure in soil, stone, and subtle tremors. To walk upon the city today is to tread upon memory itself, to feel the weight of centuries, and to acknowledge that while the living move above, the dead remain below, patient, remembered, and eternal. The earth never forgets. It holds every life, every burial, and every moral compromise. And in that memory, London finds both its foundation and its reminder. No city can flourish entirely independent of the dead it has buried.